The committee will come to order. I now recognize Mr. Lobiondo for a motion.
Pursuant to Rule 1A1 of the Rules Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, I move that the chairman be authorized to declare recess during today's hearing.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. I want to thank everybody for being here today. This is an important hearing we're having here today, and talking about some what I consider extremely important legislation, and I believe everybody on the committee, both sides of the aisle, believe that the reauthorization of the FAA, reforming it, making it a better system for all Americans is extremely important to all of us. The way America travels, moves goods, and conducts business today depends on an efficient transportation network, and in order to remain competitive, we need a 21st century infrastructure with modern 21st century technology. This is especially true of our aviation system. But the fact is the FAA's infrastructure is increasingly obsolete, and its technology is still cemented in the last century. And to just quote my colleague, my esteemed colleague from Oregon, in a hearing we had not too long ago, he said that the FAA is the only agency of government worse at procurement than the Pentagon. Congress has tried to reform it. It didn't stick. We got to try something different to get it to be more agile, to give us 21st century equipment and software we need. Then there's the issue of the actual sort of shape of the FAA bureaucracy. Congress back in 1986 gave the FAA the license to reform personal practices, to deal with some of the mid-level management bulge and streamline the agencies and decision-making process, but that didn't take either. And he goes on to propose a 21st century constitutionally chartered corporation in order to accomplish these goals and make it self-funding, self-sufficient, and not subject to appropriations or shutdowns or anything else that a Congress might imagine. Now, I think that we can see by that statement, and I think as we talk here today, we agree there is a problem. There is a solution at hand. It's just the form that we're going to debate vigorously on what we think is the best outcome. But as a result, over these past 30 years, the shocking amount of taxpayer dollars that we've wasted over the last 3.5 decades, over $50 billion. And that's why this is one of my highest priorities this year, is a comprehensive FAA reform and reauthorization bill. So far this year, we've held reauthorizations hearings looking at air transportation, manufacturing, airports, and new entrants and innovations. Today, we'll focus on the need for air traffic control reform, divesting the high-tech service, 24/7 service business from government and shifting it to an independent, not-for-profit entity. It's appropriate we are holding this hearing during the Infrastructure Week. No other single infrastructure reform has as much potential to improve travel for the average American flyer or to ensure our hard-earned leadership in aviation. Although our aviation system is safe, the FAA structure and how air traffic is managed have been broken for decades. The decision we make in the FAA reauthorization bill this year will either move us toward a 21st century aviation system America needs or doom us to repeating the failures of the past over and over again. Everyone should be reminded of what happens if we choose the status quo. It means our system will be subject to more budget constraints, sequestration, and threats of government shutdowns. Sequestration isn't gone. In sequestration led to furloughs and reduced operations. Controller hiring and training suffered, and the FAA bureaucrats tried to shut down contract towers. Fiscal constraints continue to be tight, so in the federal budget. And that's not going to change anytime soon, and it may get worse. We continue to rely on the unstable, dysfunctional annual appropriation cycle. We have had no standalone transportation appropriations bill since 2006, and over that time period, Congress has passed 42 continuing resolutions to keep government doors open. The FAA also relies on authorizing legislation, and it took Congress 23 short-term extensions over 5 years before it passed previous long-term FAA authorization bill. Under these conditions, the FAA bureaucracy has been trying to undertake a high-tech modernization of air traffic control system for over 3 decades. It's not working, and it's never going to work. Sadly, in today's digital age, our controllers still manage planes with paper strips, which of course I have brought a few to remind people of that. And if anybody hasn't been in a control tower, they ought to go into a control tower and see it. Some argue that the latest attempt to modernize NextGen is showing some signs of progress. But we all know any progress is incremental at best, and only in locations where the FAA partnered with the private sector. And let's remember, the name NextGen was really just a rebranding of the FAA's ongoing failed efforts to modernize the system. NextGen is just a marketing term, not an actual technology or innovation, but it sounds catchier, so Congress will fund it year after year. But the bottom line is there should be far more progress by now. Money has never been the problem. Congress has provided more than $7.4 billion for NextGen since 2004. Results are the problem. According to the FAA's own calculation, the return on the taxpayer's $7.4 billion invested has only been about $2 billion in benefits. And we've still got a long way to go. According to the DOT Inspector General in 2014, the projected initial cost for NextGen was $40 billion, but they've said it could double or triple and be delayed another decade. Over the years, the FAA has described NextGen as transformation of America's air transportation network. They also said it will forever redefine how we manage the system. But in 2015, the National Research Council confirmed what was already becoming painfully clear. According to the NRC, the original version of NextGen is not what was being implemented. It is not broadly transformational and is not fundamental change in the way the FAA handles air traffic. Only in the federal government would such a dismal record be considered a success. While the FAA continues to fall behind, the rest of the world is moving on with new technologies without the United States' involvement. Nothing less than America's leadership is at stake in an industry that we pioneered and have led since Kitty Hawk. Some have proposed targeting reforms to fix the FAA's problems, but that's an approach we have already tried many, many times, starting in the 1980s. Since 1995, Congress has passed various reforms to allow the FAA to run more like a business. Procurement reform in 1995 for the FAA to develop a more flexible acquisition management system. Additional reforms in 1995 exempt the FAA from most federal personal rules and allow the FAA to implement more flexible rules for hiring, training, compensating, and assigning personnel. Procurement reforms in 1996 developed a cost accounting system. Additional personal reforms in 1996 allowed FAA to negotiate pay. Organizational reforms in 2000 to establish a COO position. Additional reforms to allow greater pay so the FAA could recruit good candidates, particularly for a COO position. Additional reform in 2000 by the executive order to create the Air Traffic Organization. Organizational reforms in 2003 to establish the Joint Planning and Development Office to better coordinate NextGen. Reforms in 2012 to establish a Chief NextGen Officer. Property management reforms in 2012 to allow a better process for realignment and consolidation of facilities. All have failed to result in the FAA being run more like a business. The FAA has always performed like a massive bureaucracy and will continue to. It is the only DOT agency that serves as both transportation service provider and safety regulator. Regulating itself is an inherent conflict of interest, and separating the two functions is simply good government. It's time for reform that is truly transformational. Real change can be difficult. We've learned that over the years. But the broader lesson over the last several decades is that the true risk lies in doing nothing. Last year's bill that passed out of committee will serve as a framework for new legislation. But we are open to change. We want to talk to people and get their ideas, and that's what we hope to hear today. As we continue to move forward, our air traffic control reform proposal will be based on the following principles. Create an independent, not-for-profit corporation to provide air traffic services. Fund the new service provider by fees assessed for air traffic service. Free the new service provider from governmental dysfunction, political interference, and the uncertainty of the federal budget process. Create a governance structure that is right-sized and balanced, and a board with sole fiduciary responsibility of the organization. And I need to repeat that. Fiduciary responsibility, that's a legal term. If you're on a board of directors in the United States and you have the fiduciary responsibility, it's not to who appointed you to the board, it's to the board, it's to that organization is who you're responsible for. And that's the law. That's just not some pie in the sky. People can be removed and be prosecuted if they're not doing their fiduciary responsibilities. Ensure connectivity, access to the airspace, the continuity of air services for general aviation, small and rural communities, and airports that serve them. And let me, for the record, remind people, I'm from a rural district. I have one very small airport. I doubt I have more than a handful of people that work for the airline industry, but I have several hundred GA pilots. So if anybody thinks that I want to harm the GA or rural communities, they just don't know who I am and where I'm from, because I'm committed to make sure what we do protects small and rural communities and protects the GA community. The GA community is over $1 billion industry. Why in the world would I want to harm an industry that produces so much good for this country? We want to ensure full access to airspace and air services to support our armed services and their national security mission. Free the air traffic control business from the FAA's bureaucratic procurement process and the appropriation cycle. End the federal government's decades-long pattern of costly, delayed, failed management of modernization. Give the new service provider the ability to access financial markets, leverage private funding for multi-year capital projects needed to modernize the system. Allow the FAA to focus on its safety mission and certification mission. Ensure continued oversight of the air traffic services by the FAA, DOT, and Congress. And of course, lots of people out there saying that that's not what we're going to do, but let me be clear. The FAA, the Department of Transportation, and Congress will still maintain vigorous oversight to the airspace of this country, and ultimately allow all users of the system, including airline passengers and the general public, to realize the significant benefits of modern air traffic control system, including decreases in delays, flight times, and congestion. Previous efforts to reform the FAA and modernize the system teach us that the only way to realize these benefits is to get the government out of the way. As President Ronald Reagan said, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And we see all over the world people turning to the private sector, whether it's Europe or it's Asia, it's Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Look around the world. Countries, governments are looking to partner with the private sector because they see they do it better. Since the introduction of the AIR Act over a year ago, this has been an ongoing process of education and discussion. We've held over 130 meetings with stakeholders, including both supporters and opponents of the AIR Act. We've had numerous meetings with members of the House, the Senate, the White House, and other committees. These meetings have been extremely productive and give us new ideas to improve the legislation. As I said, I want to hear the same thing from today's witnesses. What are your ideas that we can build upon on the principles that I've outlined? We've also gone to Canada to see their system firsthand, and we will go again with more members. And I would encourage any member that wishes to go on May 25th, Thursday, in the afternoon. We'll be heading up to Canada and coming back on May 26th to, again, go up there, not so we can imitate their system, but to learn from the lessons of their system, to learn to help to fix our own broken structure. Over 60 countries have followed this kind of reform, and it's worked in each case. Opponents of reform either ignore the evidence or must believe we are less capable than the other 60 countries. And for me, that's a bit outrageous. We're the United States of America. We can do this better than anybody else, so it's time for us to take a look and to move forward. Air traffic control is not inherently a governmental function. It's a 24/7 technology service. For those who worry that the system is too complex, I would say this. The most complex thing in the airspace is not the air traffic control system, it's the airplane. It's the people at Boeing and Airbus and the Cessna and the people that build these aircraft. That's the most complicated thing in the system. And the FAA already oversees those highly sophisticated private sector aircrafting, manufacturing, maintenance, and flight operations at arm's length. We don't build airplanes today, the government doesn't, and that's the most complex thing in the system. Overseeing air traffic control is not going to be more complicated than anything else the FAA already does. This transformational reform will fix our obsolete and dysfunctional air traffic control structure, move beyond the wasteful, inefficient status quo, and benefit all the users of the system. Ultimately, reform will give the American flyer a safe, efficient aviation system using 21st century technology to ensure more on-time departures, more direct routes, using less fuel, which will be better for the environment, and less wasted time on the tarmac. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I thank the witnesses for being here, and with that, I will yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim would have been proud. That's the longest opening statement since former Chairman Jim Oberstar, but you only did it in one language, so we could have a simultaneous translation, perhaps. Thanks for the time, Mr. Chairman. First off, I spent about over an hour with Dr. Dillingham from the GAO, who I would say is the foremost expert and the longest-term critic of the FAA, its procurement process, and movement toward a 21st century system. And I'm not aware that any other member of the committee has spent that time with him, and he has not been invited to testify. He has a different story to tell today, and he thinks it will be a mistake, and I'm paraphrasing, but we are now on the cusp of a 21st century system that will be the envy of the world. And he and other experts, MITRE Corporation, others, say a massive change now, where you cleave the FAA into parts. You leave the most vital thing to our manufacturers, certification, subject to appropriations, sequestrations, and shutdowns. You leave the most vital thing that is important to the American public, which is safety and oversight of safety, subject to sequestration, shutdowns, and political meddling. The only thing that gets moved is the ATO, and the ATO would be moved and essentially effectively controlled by the airlines. I note the airlines aren't here today, perhaps because they haven't looked so great recently in public. And I'd also note that the airlines themselves have had outages 36 times, major outages, 36 times since 2015. I'm not aware that the National Air Traffic Control System has had a major disruption, with the exception of deliberate sabotage by a contractor who knew how to get the system and the backup system. But the airlines, on their own, with no sabotage, have managed to melt down their dispatch and their reservation systems 36 times, stranding millions of people, so they can do it better, right? That's an interesting question. So I think that members of this committee who want to be educated on this should take, and maybe we can invite them in here, and spend that hour with Dr. Dillingham and hear the story of how things have changed and the progress we're making and the potential for disruption at this point in time. In terms of funding, the FAA is currently projected over the next decade to be 97% self-funded. Unfortunately, the way our colleagues around here and the budget process works, despite the fact they're self-funded, they can be sequestered or shut down. That's a simple fix. Take it off budget. Make it into a trust-funded program. They are raising the revenues. That's a simple fix. No, we're going to cleave it in half, put vital functions over here, still subject to sequestration shutdown, and take this one part and put it over here and say somehow they're going to self-fund. Now, the question, of course, is how are they going to self-fund? The airlines have told me time and time again they hate the ticket tax. They hate the ticket tax. They say that's our money. I say, no, it's not your money. I buy a ticket, I pay the tax goes to the government. It's not your money. They say, no, that affects the price of the ticket and competition and everything else. It's a horrible thing. So if they do away with the ticket tax, there goes 70% of the revenues. What are they going to put in its place? It's going to be a per operation charge or something. We don't know. Congress will have no say over this. Now, there will be a board, if I could have that slide, and a construct which is, we'll show here for the person running the slides. If you could put up, come on. Could put up this slide, please. And this is the new construct. Anything that affects competition will go through this process. The board makes a decision about a new approach, a new route, new fees. All that goes through this process and then goes to the secretary. The secretary will have established a large new office of consultants within his, or at this point, her office, who will advise the secretary of a limited period of time. And if the secretary and the board disagree, they go to court. Now, that's a great way to deal with new approaches, funding, and a whole bunch of other things. Congress will have nothing to say about what people or the American people are charged for running this system. When the ticket tax goes away, what happens to the AIP program? What happens to safety? What happens to certification? We had testimony from a gentleman in here who has an intriguing new model to serve small and mid-sized cities, and he said his biggest problem is certification, and he said the people are good at the FAA, there aren't enough of them doing certification. They don't have enough funding. Well, is this new enlightened board going to generously fund that also? We have assurances. Don't worry about those things. You can put that down now. Now, we've heard other things here that are, an interesting construct, which is we are way behind because we don't use ADS-B. If I could have the first slide, please. Can we get a slide? Okay, this is the oceanic airspace. And you'll notice that the vast majority of the planes are in oceanic control by UK and Canada. So they're using ADS-B. Makes sense. Now, we're not. Currently, airlines pay to have satellite-based navigation a fee in this lower part of the chart. There aren't that many because people do the loop to the north. So in fact, we have, NAV Canada has 1 aircraft in continental airspace for every aircraft in oceanic airspace. We have 1 aircraft in oceanic airspace for every 51 in the air over the United States of America. Now go to the second slide. Oh, by the way, go to the second slide. Now, see all that yellow? That's the US. That is going to be totally ADS-B, satellite-based in 2020, with an exception. The airlines have petitioned and been given permission from the FAA for exceptions because many of their older planes do not have modern enough GPS systems to use the new ADS-B. The airlines, again, have petitioned that they have a number more years before those planes would be able to use the ADS-B system, not the FAA, the airlines themselves. Now, Canada is going to continue to have a radar-based system because they don't have much domestic traffic. And so we're being criticized because we won't pay a bunch of money for the few planes that use our oceanic airspace, but we are going to put, 100 times that many planes under ADS-B in 2020. Now, here's my fear. My fear is there were disruptions in Canada. There were disruptions in Great Britain, including the bankruptcy of the system and a bailout. And, every system that has transit, and all the others in the world have gone to government-based corporations or government-controlled corporations. And there's only 2 countries that have gone the other way. And MITRE has done studies, others have done studies. There will be a period of disruption, particularly when you're cleaving the agency in half. And the certification people over here who have to certify the new approaches, who have to certify the new equipment, they're on furlough because the stupid Congress did another shutdown or sequestration. But the ATO is up and running. Well, you can't use those new approaches because the people over here who have to certify it can't work. Now, splitting this agency in half does not make sense to me. Now, the chairman talked about the failed reforms. I sat down with the FAA administrator, who also has not been invited to testify before this committee on this subject, who I think has made tremendous strides and brought the agency way under control compared to anyone else in recent history. And he said, well, they failed because Congress failed to say that the trolls at OMB and the secretary couldn't meddle. So the proposed reforms didn't go forward because OMB took control, as they do over too many things, and then the secretary messed with it, and they ended up with a system. I know, Mr. Poole, you find this amazing, but that's the way it happened. And these did not go forward. So simply, you could just say, we are going to give authority to reform procurement. We are going to give authority to reform personnel to the head of the FAA, whose proposals will not be subject to OMB because they're now self-funding and will not be subject to meddling by the Secretary of Transportation and her staff. That would be a significant way to get there. Put it off budget. It's already raising the revenue it needs, but no, we're going to have a new corporation that's going to figure out a different way to raise revenue. By the way, forget about safety, forget about certification. They're afterthoughts over there in the government, not funded by any stable source. I've invited a witness today, and I hope people listen carefully, Joe Brown. He's the president of Hartzell Propeller. His family has been involved in the aviation business since the Wright brothers, actually. It's an interesting story, but he won't have a chance to tell that today because I want him to focus on his experience both in that industry and as a pilot, and to talk about what he sees as the things that are at risk as a pilot, a GA pilot in this country, and things that we have done that are extraordinary for GA pilots that would be at risk in a new system, because why would the commercial airlines give a darn about all those GA airports and all those new improved approaches and updating those? Because that costs money. And that's not in their interest. They don't use them. They don't care. So we'll hear from him, and I think his testimony is going to be a little more compelling than a couple of think tank people that we're going to hear from yet again and again and again. But we haven't heard from the FAA administrator, we haven't heard from Dr. Dillingham, but Ms. Robine is here for the second or third time, and Mr. Poole for the umpteenth time from his wonderful right-wing think tank. So that's what we have before us, Mr. Chairman. I do think there are things we could agree upon, but you know, I do not believe that privatizing the ATO is the answer. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman. You almost equaled my opening statement, so you were too much short. But look, this hearing is going to be about, it has to be about knocking down things that just aren't true. What Mr. DeFazio puts up on his chart, it's not my proposal. I don't know whose proposal it is. It may be Mr. DeFazio's proposal, but it's not mine. And let me just start off to undermine the whole thing, start at the very, very top. It says on his chart, if they decide to increase passenger aviation taxes, they cannot, this new entity cannot increase taxes. They don't, under law, they cannot do that. Second, it says the corporation decides to change ATC, or let me finish with that. Well, we're going to have a debate, I think. The only person that can raise taxes is the United States Congress. So that's patently false. The second thing at the top is the corporation decides to change ATC safety procedures. That can't happen. They have to come back to the regulator, to the FAA. So again, I don't know whose chart this is. It's certainly not my chart. So as we move forward, I hope folks...
You might want to call that fake news.
I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. And just one other point that the gentleman said, he said Congress and the OMB failed. He's absolutely right. He's making my case. We have to take this out of the Congress, out of the OMB, stopping the way they operate. It's crazy. But again, I'm concerned that he's taken it all out. Will there be any oversight in his new idea of how to run it? But again, this chart, the chart that he put up there, that's not my chart. So, ladies and gentlemen, I got to be very clear on that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could rebut for 1 minute.
You certainly can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. They can set user fees. User fees I consider to be taxes. I consider the ticket tax to be a user fee, but we can argue semantics over that, but they are going to determine how the system is funded, which is tantamount to taxation without review by the Ways and Means Committee or Congress. And secondly, I'm not proposing, I am proposing to give the FAA administrator that authority free of OMB and secretarial interference, and also we would give them a budget that is free from sequestration and shutdowns through their own funding mechanism. Congress would set the funding if it needs to be adjusted. Congress could intervene if they felt the reforms weren't warranted, unlike in your privatized system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and we will now go to our witnesses. I'd like to welcome again our panel. I believe everybody's testified before us before on at least one occasion, or maybe a few. First, the Honorable Calvin Scoville III, the Inspector General of the United States Department of Transportation, has been here many times. Joseph W. Brown, the President of Hartzell Propeller Incorporated, I believe you testified in 2014. So this is your second time here. Mr. Robert Poole, Director of the Transportation Policy at the Research Foundation, who's been thinking deeply about this subject for many years. Mr. Paul Rinaldi, the President of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, who's been before us before, and Dorothy Robon, the independent policy analyst and former Clinton administration official, who again has been through the wars on this many, many times, and we appreciate you being back here to look at your insights. So again, I look forward to hearing your testimony. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record, and without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And with that, Mr. Scoville, you may proceed.
Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on FAA's efforts to implement reforms and modernize the national airspace system. My testimony today will focus on OIG's past and ongoing work regarding FAA's efforts to implement various agency-wide reforms, as well as its progress and challenges with
Can you pull that mic a little closer to you?
Yes, sir.
Don't be afraid of it.
While my office does not make policy recommendations, I will also discuss how other countries have structured their aviation systems and highlight key factors that policymakers may wish to consider in evaluating FAA's structure. Over the last 2 decades, FAA has made several reforms in response to congressional mandates to improve operations, cost effectiveness, and management. These include establishing new employee compensation systems as well as an acquisition management system. FAA has also undertaken multiple reorganizations to improve the agency's efficiency and reduce expenses. In addition, FAA achieved more than $2 billion in cost savings over a 13-year period by outsourcing flight service stations. Despite this progress, FAA's reforms have not achieved their intended cost or productivity outcomes. Instead, budgets have increased, with a 35% increase in FAA's total budget after adjusting for inflation between fiscal years 1996 and 2015. In addition, FAA's productivity initiatives for its air traffic controller workforce have not yielded improvements, in part because FAA did not establish measurable productivity and cost goals or metrics. FAA's reforms have also fallen short in improving its ability to deliver key next-gen technologies on time and within budget. This is due to long-standing management weaknesses, such as overambitious plans, unreliable cost and schedule estimates, unstable requirements, and ineffective contract management. For example, FAA has made progress with its 6 next-gen transformational programs, such as installing the ground system for ADS-B. However, FAA has not determined when the programs will start delivering benefits or how they will improve air traffic flow or controller productivity. Although FAA currently estimates the 6 projects at $5.7 billion, their total costs and completion dates remain unknown, in part because their requirements continue to evolve. Furthermore, weaknesses with internal controls and oversight problems have hindered FAA's contract management, which we found in our reviews of sole source, service support, and small business set-aside contracts. To its credit, FAA has worked with industry to identify and launch some of the highest priority next-gen capabilities. For example, a key priority is performance-based navigation, or PBN, which allows more fuel-efficient aircraft routes and reduces airport congestion. FAA fully deployed these procedures at the Northern California Metroplex in 2015, well ahead of schedule. FAA has also deployed new technologies at some airports to enhance controller-to-pilot data communications and runway operations. Yet many risks remain to complete these and other next-gen priorities, and full benefits for users remain years away. Key challenges include addressing community noise concerns with PBN routes, resolving avionics issues, and integrating complex onboard systems and controller technologies. As Congress, the administration, and stakeholders consider FAA structure, other nations may offer a helpful comparison. At the request of this committee, we reviewed the aviation systems of Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. All 4 have separated their safety and oversight functions, which remain government-controlled, from the air traffic control functions. Air traffic control has been commercialized, their term, into air navigation service providers via various organizational structure. These providers finance their operations through user fees and may finance their infrastructure and modernization efforts with long-term bonds and other debt instruments. They also embark on smaller modernization efforts and roll them out incrementally using a variety of methods, such as modifying commercial off-the-shelf products. Yet any discussion on NextGen's structure should consider our nation's unique characteristics. As you know, the U.S. runs the busiest and most complex aviation system in the world, with more operations each year than the other 4 nations combined. Safety, financing, and labor issues will also be key questions. Ultimately, safety will remain the top priority in overseeing our national airspace system. Regardless of what the future looks like, strong controls and oversight will be vital to maintain a safe, innovative transportation system. This concludes my statement, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering questions you or the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Scoville. And with that, Mr. Brown, you may proceed.
Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, members of this committee.
You can bring your mic closer. Get it right up close to it, because then we can hear you better. We want to
Is
make
this
sure
better?
Better.
Yeah, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Mr. DeFazio, and members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Joe Brown, and I come today as a businessman and a pilot. I also represent a company called Hartzell Propeller, a 100-year-old aviation business whose roots trace to the Wright brothers. Located in rural Ohio, we do our business out of a 4,000-foot runway that takes us all over this country to our customers in Texas and Florida and Georgia and Minnesota and everywhere in between. Because our customers build airplanes, they're on airports. Our business depends, and their business depend, on the amazing infrastructure that the citizens of this country have put into the national airspace. And we also depend on another thing, which is the incredible freedom to fly that we enjoy in this country. And because of those things, we've made a market in this country like no other for aviation, and we are very grateful for that and deeply invested. Now, as a pilot, 400 to 500 hours a year, my office is the cockpit. And when I fly, I find a modern system, a high-functioning system, and I have seen it evolve over time right before my eyes. I find controllers that do their job well. I find easy access and powerful technology. I can file a flight plan from my smartphone and get my proposed route back before I get to the airport in a text. When I take off, I have GPS navigation systems on board that allow me to fly point to point all over this country. A couple months ago, I took off out of the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area and got cleared direct to Burlington, Vermont, 1,300 miles ahead. And while I'm flying, I have the veil of safety brought to you by ADSB, which is in fact deployed, giving me traffic callouts and separation cues and weather in my route of flight. And when I come in for landing, I can pick from 3,000 precision approaches brought to me by a NextGen feature called WAS, including at my home airport, which I value tremendously on foul weather days. So the bottom line for me is NextGen is working. It works for me every day, and it's getting stronger all the time. And from a technology standpoint, I believe we're on the right track. It's proper to ask in modernization, where should we go next? Many are arguing that what we should do is spend the next 5 to 7 years focusing on the structure and the governance of our air traffic organization. I don't like that risk profile. I don't think we should be distracted. As a businessman, I think that what we will find is that we will raise more questions than we can answer, questions that don't have clear answers, and questions that will burn up precious time trying to answer, like how will we assure equity among users, and how will we finance this organization, and what borrowing risk can it take? And what about new market entrants? How do they fit into the picture? And that doesn't even address whether the people are better served by the structure after we transfer so much national wealth to it. Because I'm a business guy, I get to evaluate a lot of companies, and I've bought several. And we have a simple framework when we're looking at an investment. We say, what are its strengths? Can they be leveraged? Do they differentiate it in the business we're trying to do? And what are its weaknesses? And do we understand those weaknesses, and can we fix them? And when both of those things are true, we buy that company, because we know if we elevate strengths and reduce weaknesses, we will create value. And in my calculus, the ATO presents exactly that risk profile: enormous strengths, world-class systems, and very specific weaknesses that we can address. The conclusion I've drawn is that we should not spend 5 to 7 years distracted by change, knowing that things take longer and cost more, with the hope that at the end, this restructuring journey will deliver a big payoff. What's next? I think that we should stay on track with the technology plans that the NextGen Advisory Committee and the FAA have agreed to. The stakeholders are already aligned, and the technology that's in the field works, and there's more technology coming. Let's keep tuning and strengthening the collaboration that's been driving so much progress. Even government overseers recognize that the NextGen Advisory Committee is having impact, and it's been run by an airline executive. So clearly, the strongest voice is setting the priorities. Let's expand on the technologies that are already deployed. For example, Datacom is in the field today at 55 towers in the country, and we'll be delivering en-route services to aircraft by 2019. NextGen is deployed and getting better all the time. But let's tackle specific weaknesses that we have in the system, like the way we finance the FAA and the ATO, and the way we give them mechanisms for doing long-term capital planning and investment. And finally, let's work on that ATC infrastructure. There are a number of ways that private-public partnerships could put these guys in better buildings. In the next 5 to 7 years, we could have them all in better buildings. I encourage us to take a different path, to think about options that are fixing the fixable and elevating strengths. Thank you for the time today. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. And Mr. Poole, may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member DeFazio. As some of you know, I've been researching this subject for close to 4 decades. Most recently, I've been part of 2 working groups, one for the Business Roundtable and the other from the Eno Center. Both groups have concluded that we have major fundamental funding and structural problems, and that corporatization of the ATO is the best solution. That was also the conclusion that the FAA Management Advisory Council reached unanimously in their 2014 report that called for corporatizing the ATO. My focus this morning is primarily on the issue of governance. The Business Roundtable Group recommended a nonprofit corporation in which customers and other stakeholders govern. This is basically a user co-op, except for the addition of other stakeholders.
Can you pull that mic a little closer to you?
Besides users, sorry.
That thing moves, I think. Pull the whole box towards you,
All right.
please. Thank
The
you.
structure proposed is basically a user co-op with the addition of other stakeholders. And the governance model that was proposed in last year's bill, as recommended by BRT and Eno, was intended to be a U.S. adaptation of NAV Canada's nonprofit stakeholder-governed corporation, running in the best interest of all the stakeholders. But the stakeholder board from last year has been described misleadingly as giving control over the airspace to the major airlines. This, of course, has led to serious concerns from general aviation groups, people in small towns with small airports, and rural legislators. But in a nonprofit user co-op, there are no shareholders. Every board member has equal vote with any others. So even if there were airlines on it, which they won't be, they would only have a small minority of the members, and they could easily be outvoted by other members because all votes are equal. It's not like in a corporation where you have preferred shareholders. Now, this model is consistent with international aviation law, with ICAO principles, and with global best practices. And the proposal did not originate with the airlines. I'd like to set the record straight on this. The Business Roundtable Group began in 2011, made an initial presentation to A4A in the spring of 2012. We got a pretty cool, if not negative, reception at that point. No one wanted to restart the battles that had raged over this issue in previous decades. Everything changed in the spring of 2013, thanks to the sequester. Controller furloughs, closed FAA Academy, threatened closure of 189 contract towers, got everybody's attention. In response, A4A, NATCA, and AOPA all requested new conversations with the BRT working group. And in May 2013, all 3 groups in the conference room at Business Roundtable agreed that an air traffic control corporation, converting the ATO into a corporation, self-funded and out of the federal budget, was the best approach. After this happened, that fall, Governor Engler and several others briefed Chairman Schuster on the proposal. This is not coming from the airlines. The BRT group included a former FAA administrator, the former chief operating officer of the ATO, 2 former senior officials of US DOT, and several consultants. Our governing model, as I said, was patterned after NAV Canada's. Their stakeholder board represents airlines, general aviation, unions, and the government, plus 4 other private citizens selected by the stakeholder members. No board member at NAV Canada can hold any paid position in an aviation organization. It's a system that really works. And of their 4 airline seats elected by airlines, 2 are from major airlines, retired people. 1 is from an air tour company, and 1 is from a regional airline serving the far north. Now, the U.S. is larger and has a much larger general aviation community. JA as a key stakeholder should have more than 1 seat. Since small airports are so vital, airports definitely are a stakeholder that should be electing a board seat as well. And I think in terms of the airlines, regional airlines and cargo airlines should be defined as stakeholders in addition to perhaps 2 seats from the major carriers. My written testimony gives 1 example of a proposed 15-member stakeholder board. Let me close with the concerns of small airports. Having airports and regional airlines as stakeholder is part of the answer, but Congress needs to deal with the fears about loss of control towers at small airports and worries that somehow service might be dropped in rural areas. First of all, Congress could specify that any airport meeting a reasonable benefit cost test should be assured of getting tower services, which is the standard today. Second, FAA would be in charge of aviation safety, and no changes in procedures or equipment could happen, but they might be proposed by the corporation, would have to pass muster with the FAA and could not be done unilaterally. Third, ATO's inadequate funding today gives airports the short end of the stick. There has been a moratorium on contract towers since fiscal year 2014. So small airports are losing today in what they need because of FAA's ongoing budget problems. A self-funded corporation would mean improvements for small airports, thanks, number 1, to predictable user fee revenues and a financed capital improvement for facilities. Secondly, a corporation would very likely implement remote tower technology that would increase the benefits from having a tower because of better surveillance, reduce the costs, and therefore the benefit-cost ratio would be higher, more small airports would qualify. This would be a boon for small airports, not a detriment. That concludes my testimony, and I'll be happy to deal with questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poole. With that, Mr. Rinaldi may proceed. Thank you.
Morning, Chairman Schuster, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify
Microphone.
in
Slide
front
that
of you
whole thing
today.
towards you. The whole box. There you go.
How about that? We currently run the largest, safest, most efficient, most complex, most diverse airspace system in the world. It contributes $1.5 trillion to our gross domestic product and provides over 12 million American jobs. Our national airspace system is unique, unequaled, and unrivaled by any country. This is due in large part to the impeccable work the men and women that I represent do every day. NACA members guide approximately 70,000 flights per day in the United States, ensuring over 900 million passengers arrive safely at their destination every year. The United States airspace system is considered the gold standard in the aviation community, but that status is at risk. Unstable, unpredictable funding and status quo threatens it. We need a stable, reliable, predictable funding stream to operate our current system and allow for growth in the United States aviation system. Although NACA is calling for change, we cannot support any proposal without fully reviewing all its details. It's not only that we oppose the status quo, which is very much broken. We also oppose any system that would put ATC in a for-profit model. In order for NACA to consider support of any proposal, it must meet our 4 core principles of reform. First, any new system must keep the safety and the efficiency of the national airspace system the top priority. Second, any reform must protect our members' employment relationship. This must maintain our members' pay, benefits, retirement system, healthcare system, as well as their work rules in our contract. Third, any reform system must have a stable, predictable funding stream adequately enough to support air traffic control services, growth, new users, staffing, hiring, training, long-term modernization projects. Also, this reform must provide a stable funding stream through a transition period. Fourth, any reform must maintain a dynamic, diverse aviation system that continues to provide services to all segments of the aviation community and to all airports across America. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to continue to provide services to many of the diverse users in the national airspace system, both large and small, new and old, big city to rural America. The United States has a vibrant general aviation community that relies upon us. Rural America's economy success is tied to access to the national airspace system. Last year, NACA supported the Air Act of 2016 because it met these 4 core principles. While we do not believe there is only one solution to the problems, we will carefully review all proposals using the same standard. Please don't take NACA's position as a need for stable, predictable funding as to mean the appropriators have not done their job. The appropriators in both chambers of Congress on both sides of the aisles have done their job well. The problem stems from lack of regular order we've been experiencing for over 10 years now. This lack of regular order has led to stop-and-go funding, many threats of shutdown, and our current staffing shortage. We're at a 28-year low of fully certified controllers. We have 10,532 certified controllers. Approximately 3,000 of them are eligible to retire at this time. In addition, unstable funding has prevented on-time implementation of NextGen modernization projects. NACA takes pride in our role in partnering with the FAA in developing and implementing important modernization projects. We have successfully worked on many over the years. Unfortunately, all have been impacted by uncertainty of funding. If you just look at FY 2018, as we approached April 28th of this year, the FAA shifted its focus from NextGen to shutdown. We then received a 1-week funding extension, followed by a 5-month funding bill. While we're elated over the funding bill, 5 months is certainly no way to plan for the future in aviation. Congress needs to pass an FAA reauthorization bill that provides stable, reliable, predictable funding. Congress should exempt the FAA employees from indiscriminate sequester cuts. Otherwise, we will see a hiring freeze, reduced staffing, furloughs, delays, reduced capacity, and suspension of key NextGen programs. I want to thank you for calling this hearing. We must all remain vigilant and focused on the horizon as we try to expand and modernize the national airspace system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rinaldi. And with that, Ms. Robine, you can proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, members of the committee. I appreciate being here this morning. I am a policy wonk, and I'm a Democrat. I testified before some of you during the 5 years I spent in the Obama administration, first as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment, and then as the GSA Public Buildings Commissioner following the scandal at GSA. Previously, I spent 8 years on President Clinton's White House economic team, where during his second term, I was the point person on aviation and air traffic control, among other issues, a policy focus I maintained after leaving the White House, first at Brookings and then as an economic consultant. The first point I want to make this morning is that corporatization of the air traffic control system is not a radical idea, nor is it a Republican idea. The Clinton administration tried unsuccessfully to do this in 1995 with its proposal to create a self-supporting government corporation, USATS, which would be run by a CEO and a board and regulated at arm's length by the FAA. At the time, only 4 countries had corporatized their air traffic control system. Now, more than 60 other countries have done so. The second point I want to make is that the rationale for USATS applies no less today than it did in 1995. Let me briefly restate it. 1, air traffic control is not an inherently governmental function. It is not inherently governmental. Keeping planes safely separated is complex and safety critical, but it is a purely operational process that follows well-established rules. Like running an airline or manufacturing a Boeing 787, air traffic control can be performed by a non-governmental entity as long as it is subject to oversight by FAA safety regulators whose job is inherently governmental. 2, precisely because of the operational nature of the air traffic control system, the federal government is poorly suited to running it. The consensus of countless blue ribbon commissions and expert reports is that air traffic management is a 24/7 technology-intensive service business trapped in a regulatory agency that is constrained by federal budget rules, burdened by a flawed funding mechanism, and micromanaged by Congress and the Office of Management and Budget. Is it a monopoly? Yes, at least for now. But the telephone system was a monopoly for many years, and we didn't have the government operate that. The final rationale for USATs, the current arrangement is flawed on safety grounds. This is important. Echoing safety experts worldwide, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, has long called for the air traffic control regulator to be independent of the operation it regulates in order to avoid conflicts of interest. We are one of the only industrial nations in which the same agency both regulates and operates the air traffic control system. In sum, 22 years after USATS was dead on arrival when it got to Congress, the international aviation community treats air traffic control as a commercial service business, and most countries have spun it off as an autonomous, self-supporting entity, both to give it the agility that a business needs and to provide the necessary separation from the safety regulator. The U.S. has gone from failed innovator to laggard. The current proposal, the AIR Act, differs from USATS in one important way. USATS was a government corporation because that was the only model that existed in 1995. NAV Canada, which came along a short time later, has shown us a better approach for the reasons you've heard and that we'll discuss further this morning. Had NAV Canada existed in 1995, I strongly suspect that it, rather than New Zealand's government corporation, the best model at the time, would have been the prototype for the Clinton administration's USATS proposal. In closing, let me say that I have listened long and hard to the arguments made by opponents of the chairman's proposal, particularly Democrats. I look forward to discussing these criticisms this morning, but I think it is a mistake to view this proposal as ideological, as one committee member characterized it last year. I believe in a robust federal role in many areas, and I think the federal government gets far too little credit for its accomplishments. But I also believe that the federal government has often excelled by recognizing where its direct involvement is necessary and where it is not to achieving its objectives. And sometime I'd like to tell you about privatized military family housing as the greatest quality of life program the Defense Department has ever implemented. That's not ideology, that's good government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Robine. We're going to start with questions. I would ask all members to stick to 5 minutes. If we need to go to a second round, I'd be more than happy to indulge. First question I have to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, I really appreciate you being here. It's the second time you've testified for this committee, and you and I have sat down, I think, on a couple of occasions to talk privately about your concerns in the industry and in general. Of all the witnesses there, I feel like I'm a kindred spirit with you. I was a business owner myself, so I know what you do every day, getting up, making sure you're meeting the bills, making sure your operations are functioning, and again, in a world that you've got to deal with an agency like the FAA sometimes can be challenging. But as a business owner, would you allow your businesses to grow a budget, your operational budget, 95% over a 10 or 15-year period? While at the same time the cost of service increases 75%, and all the while you're losing customers. Would that be something that you would tolerate as a business owner?
Of course not. I'd be very concerned about that if I was a business owner.
And I would too. And I think you're absolutely on the mark. When you look at a business, you look at the strengths, what can you leverage, how can you make it stronger, and the weaknesses, and can you change them? And so I would say on that business model, when you're in the business world, that works. But when you're dealing with the federal government, that weaknesses part, there's not a way we can change this. We've tried for 30 years to change it. And the only way to do it is, I believe, is separation. I don't want to speak for Mr. DeFazio, but he believes separation, but looks different than I do. So again, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate you laying out. But the thing we're really up against here is trying to change something that's not been able to be changed for 35 years. And that's the real challenge we face here and we have to address. But thank you so much for being here. I appreciate that. I'd like to ask Mr. Rinaldi. I brought the paper strips here today that I was introduced to by Mr. Rinaldi. These are the paper strips, the DC area TRACOM for 1 day. This is what we use. And Mr. Rinaldi, could you talk to me a little bit about the paper strips? Why do we use them? And what's our most modern our towers? And I think we have our most modern towers you can throw up on the screen there.
Well, those are paper strips that we stuff all day long in our towers across the country and move. As we move the control of an airplane from position to position, we pass the strip to controller to controller. We have tried, and we're actually in the process one more time, and this is another reason why an interruption in funding could be a problem. We are working right now with the agency and with Leidos on a new program that would actually move that to 100% electronic, as other countries around the world are using electronic. It is an efficiency thing. If you look at our new towers in San Francisco,
Is that San Francisco?
that's San Francisco right there on a foggy day, which happens a lot in San Francisco, and ground stops. The controller is actually just moving paper around that little work area because just to keep some type of order of how the airplane is going to come out.
And can they put up the Las Vegas tower too?
That's the first, yeah, that's Las Vegas right there. These are both brand new FAA facilities.
They're the most modern.
Well, they're the newest facilities. They were actually supposed to have an electronic flight strip program in them. The problem is it's because of reduced funding, we were never able to make it on time. So we're using paper now, which is still very safe. We're just losing some efficiencies. But we would like to get to an electronic flight strip program as they use around the
And the
world.
thing that tipped me off that this is the most modern tower you have is that's a plastic container they're putting them in, not a wooden crate. So they've advanced to plastics. So that's pretty impressive. But show us the Nav Canada tower. Can you talk a little bit about what Nav Canada does?
Well, as you can see, the controller has a good line of sight. Head's not down looking at paper. All the information is in front of them, and it's definitely more efficient.
And can I ask one further question? Would you say that the London airspace is the most or least complex airspace in the world?
I would say that around London Heathrow, is that what you're talking about? London Heathrow Airport, I would say it's a very busy, complex airspace.
Extremely complex. And what system are they using?
They're using the Nav Canada flight strip program.
Canada. Okay. All right. I thank you very much for that, and I yield to Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, I don't think you quite got a chance to respond to Mr. Schuster's question. Would you like to expand on your answer there?
Yes, I would. The way that I've been thinking about this is as a businessman, and I think the national airspace is a fundamental economic driver in our country. Our country is more aviation-centric than any other country in the world. You can see that in the traffic patterns and the utilization and the number of pilots. And the way I think about this whole, what is the value return on the level of investment that we make in our ATO and our airspaces? What industry have we created in this country? What are the returns on that industry? So what I think is that when you have a question like that sent to somebody like me, I immediately go to the larger and very, very significant economic value of an industry that exists uniquely in this country. We're the market leader in aircraft production of every type and stripe. We're the market leader in engine production of every type and stripe. We have the best avionics manufacturers in the world. And that is generating an enormous public return in tax revenues and jobs. So I think you have to put all the economic value in the bucket before you ask a question that's just yes or no, in my opinion.
Thank you. Mr. Rinaldi, I'm sure you're familiar with the 2002 collision between DHL and a Russian passenger aircraft under the aegis of Skydive, the Swiss government corporation. What caused that?
That was caused between lack of communication between ANSPs.
And wasn't there one person on duty who had multiple tasks?
It was a fatigue issue with the controllers also. Yeah.
Right. So little problem with cutbacks in the controller workforce under the private corporation. But they have kept safety oversight separate. Is that correct? From the government corporation? Yeah.
That is correct.
When's the last time we had an air-to-air collision here due to a controller error?
A very long time, and I don't like to talk about them.
Right. So you must have said at least 20 times during your testimony and your answer, funding, stability, sequestration, furloughs, talking about our much more sophisticated electronic flight strips, which are going to integrate other aspects of the system and have much more capability than the much more static model used by NAV Canada that actually was offered to the FAA a decade ago here, and they didn't think it made it up with all the new capabilities of NextGen. And I think you said there, you weren't saying, I don't think it'll work. You said, we're worried about delays and reduced funding. Did you not?
That's correct. I have no doubt we will be able to develop our own system. It really comes from we're working collaboratively with the manufacturer along with the FAA. It really comes from a lack of funding or funding uncertainty as we move forward.
So, Mr. Scoville, would you agree that that is a significant problem?
I would, Mr. DeFazio. Funding is a significant problem, as you and Mr. Rinaldi have pointed out. However, I would also say that there are other issues to bear in addition to funding.
That's fine. And so let's see, if I think about it, funding, sequestration, shutdowns, that all has to do with Congress. So if we had the FAA with its current funding sources, 97% projected over the next 10 years, so just a few efficiencies would get us to 100% self-funded without meddling, exempt them from sequestration and shutdowns. Would that solve many of your concerns? I'm not saying all, but would that solve many of your concerns, Mr. Rinaldi?
Yes, as I said in my opening statement, we don't believe there's one answer to the problems here, but we do believe the status quo is unacceptable, and we would not look at a for-profit model. But we would look at anything that was proposed and just hold our core principles against
Well,
what
let me
was
just interrupt.
proposed.
Quickly, Mr. Brown, when we had, last hearing, one of the many, Mr. Poole's been to, he said if there was a problem and ATC became insolvent, customers would have to pay more. And then the question, of course, becomes, if it then fails, who's responsible? Who would be responsible if the ATC failed financially in this country?
Well, that's one of my risk calculus when I think about this problem. The day the assets move out of the public sector and into the private sector, we've moved the essence of the system and the people with it. And there's no way we can spend one day without that system full functioning and healthy and thriving. And so all the financial risk accrues to the people regardless of where that monopoly reports.
Too big to fail.
Too big to fail is my concern.
I think I've heard that before. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. With that, Mr. Lobionda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scoville, for you. Over 3 years ago, Mr. Larson and I directed the FAA and the NextGen Advisory Committee to come up with 4 capabilities that could provide near-term benefits given the constrained federal budget that we work with. These priorities were supposed to be the low-hanging fruit, the things the FAA could get done and prove to the industry that they can deliver the benefits. I think I'm now hearing you say that for many of the NAC priorities, full implementation of all capabilities and the realization of those benefits remain years away. So the question for you, Mr. Scoville, is why are the NAC priorities or the easy things taking 6 to 7 years to implement?
Thank you, sir. You're right. The 4 NAC priorities have been the focus of effort for both industry and FAA. Perhaps unbeknownst at the time, or certainly not fully appreciated at the time, there were significant risks to each of them, whether we're talking about PBN, the datacom, surface operations, or multiple runway operations. Each of those presented its own problems in bringing them to fruition. I would say that right now we're at the point where the time frame of 2019, perhaps, when datacom in the en route environment is supposed to be implemented, begin to be implemented, through maybe 2021, will be what we in my office are calling a pivot point for the realization of benefits from these 4 NAC priorities.
So with this pivot point, I mean, what's your assessment if we don't make this? I mean, does this ripple out for how long, or can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We don't know. FAA has had problems. It's no secret. Making completion deadlines before, honoring representations to Congress and the Secretary as to where they are in different programs. FAA, together with the NAC, have an implementation program and a working group that's bird-dogging it as closely as they possibly can. However, the problems that are outlined in my written statement are significant. They may yet derail the program to some extent. The choice at that point is to continue to press forward. So it may go on beyond 2020, 2021, but at this point, we don't know.
Congressman, would it be okay if I added something to that?
So, yes.
One of the things that I don't think is getting a fair discussion in the modernization effort that we're in is that first you have to invent and deploy the technology, which has generally been the FAA's purpose, but then the user community has to equip, and in many cases change equipment to experience the benefits. And that's exactly where we are right now, and that's why there's an inflection point coming up. We have ADS-B fully deployed on a nationwide basis in terms of the ground structure, but only a percentage of the aircraft flying enjoy the benefits because they are not ADS-B compliant. Likewise, that will be true of Datacom and other technologies. So where we are right now is the FAA has done a lot of heavy lifting, and the users have to equip. And in the next several years, that's why the transformative change is going to flow into the system.
I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Schuster.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to point out, we continue to come back to this, the argument that, and not an argument, but the facts are, it's the Congress and it's OMB and the political process that causes these, big part of these problems, along with the bureaucracy. So taking an agency out of government and already going right to failing and going bankrupt, if everybody recalls on 9/11, we injected, I think it was $15 billion into the airline industry to prop them up. We had to have an aviation industry. So I'm not willing to sit here and say this agency is going to fall, because I don't believe it is, because most of the money can be provided by the users. And if you look at the model that we've been looking at in Canada, they have a reserve fund. They did not require the federal government of Canada to inject money. The British did. The British, for a for-profit, and as Mr. Rinaldi says, I have no intent. I would oppose going for a for-profit organization. I think that, again, using this as too big to fail, we faced that in 2001, but there are models out there that we can look at and learn from to make sure that they're set up in a proper form. But the most important thing, and again, I keep hearing agreement over and over again, it's the bureaucracy, it's OMB, it's the Congress. The starts and stops would cause these problems. So with that, I recognize Mr. Larson for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, I'd ask unanimous consent for the written statement of PASS and the National Business Aviation Association to be entered in the record. Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent?
Yes.
Thank you very much. For Mr. Rinaldi, you're a member of the FAA's Management Advisory Council, is that correct?
I am, sir.
Yeah, sir. So on March 15th this year, the MAC, shorthand is MAC, issued a letter calling for reforms that would not require splitting up the FAA, and you signed the letter along with other members of the MAC. So do you agree with the MAC's recommendations, or how should we read that from your end of things?
I do. And as I said in my opening statement, there are many ways to fix this problem. We don't think there's just one. Just so you do know that that letter was circulated. I did offer edits, and it was not incorporated into it. But I do support that letter that we need stable, predictable funding and flexibility in our budgets.
And they're different. And you argued there are different ways to achieve that goal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Inspector, we heard in some comments today that the air traffic control system is safe, but it's broken. I fly 2,306 qualified air miles one way on United Airlines and back again for my commute. Can this system be safe and broken, or should I drive?
It is safe, of course, and that's
How can it be
certainly a big
safe
plus
if it's
for
broken?
FAA.
It seems to me that there's a fundamental argument going on here that says we have to go to privatization because the system is broken that actually controls the airspace. And if it's broken, I don't know how it can be safe, and so it would support the privatization argument. However, if it can't be safe and broken, it would seem to undermine the whole argument for privatization.
I would characterize the system currently, it certainly is safe, and the record shows that. for a number of years now, no commercial aviation fatal accidents. As far as broken, I would take issue with that characterization. I would say certainly modernization has been lagging, far behind where it should be, but it's not broken.
Well, that's good to hear. I'll cancel my car rental. Mr. Brown, I just want to explore a separate issue with you, but it's tied because we're trying to get an authorization bill done. And I think largely there's bipartisan support on a lot of issues, including with differences around the edges, UAS, incorporation into the airspace, certification reforms. Seems to me all these are being held up by this debate on the to be or not to be question with regards to privatizing the air traffic control system. Can you talk a little bit, just briefly, about why certification is important, why some of these other issues are important that we move forward on, but yet we ourselves are lagging on getting them done because we continue this debate over and over on privatization?
I am happy to do that. I would say that Congress has been incredibly supportive of the idea of facilitating improved ways to market through certification. We have had great support and friends in Congress come to our aid to try to make our United States aviation industry as strong as possible. And that's been matched with very good appropriation support as well. So the thing is we all tend to agree that there are opportunities and we tend to line up behind them. What's troubling is when they get stopped in mid-stride because they can't get into the regulatory basis. And what that means to me is that we are market leaders in all of our product categories in aviation, and when we can't go to market in the ways that these reforms allow us to do, well, then somebody else is gaining on our heels. And at the end of the day, I always care about extending competitive advantage. Of course, the other thing that's often been a problem is that if you create uncertainty, customers have no idea whether they want to invest now or later, and they err on the side of later. So for me, there is something really important about keeping the vital function of certification up and running and manifesting the reforms that we all agree to.
Well, I appreciate hearing that, and I want to be sure folks did hear that. I thought that would be the answer. It's just that this main point is that this is not, we're not working on a privatization bill, we're working on an FAA reauthorization bill, as many moving parts, many of which we agree on, Democrats and Republicans, and yet those are being held up by this one debate. And it seems to me we can move forward on the things we agree on moving forward. So I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize Chairman Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. This is a very interesting one, but you know my interest in my state that 80% of our communities are not connected by highways. We have in that area of aviation, we have 700 airstrips, more than any state in the union, by the way. We have 8,000 pilots and 10,000 per capita as far as aircraft. And my interest is in general aviation, and the chairman and I have discussed this before, and as long as Alaska is taking care of their need for general aviation and not being run by the larger airlines, I'll be somewhat interested in what we're doing. And it means a lot to me. Some of you haven't been there. I think, Mr. Brown, you did fly in Alaska, did you not? For, what, 2 years?
I had a chance to spend a few weeks up there flying around the backcountry.
Okay, and did you have any trouble with air traffic controllers?
I did not. They're
That's
few
good,
and far
because
between.
I think they're some of the best. But I would like to ask Mr. Scoville, did Canada file its system for bankruptcy?
Not that I'm aware, sir.
You sure I'm just curious about that because that always concerns me. I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, my interest, I think we may be addressing the one spot is probably the best part of the FAA is the air traffic controllers, but the FAA itself, the management, is not in good shape. I don't know how you change that. I think maybe we ought to spend our time on studying the regulations that they pass. I don't know if the last time I checked a book about that big of regulations, why the FAA doesn't work. I have a classic example in Alaska where they came down with a regulation where a village that does not have navigation or an on-site weather reporter or any modern technology have not done so, aircraft can come in, and because it's perfectly clear, aircraft can come, but cannot land because they have someone on the ground to tell them what the weather is. That's a regulation. So I think, Mr. Chairman, I'm interested in seeing what we can do about revamping the whole FAA, but not the air traffic controllers so much, but the system they have is badly managed. And if we can do that, I'm willing to listen to a lot of things you got to suggest.
Gentlemen, yield the rest of his time to me?
Yeah.
Appreciate the gentleman saying that, and that's what we're after. And the gentleman knows. But maybe I should say the gentleman's guilty because you've been here since 1973 or 4.
Abraham Lincoln and I flew airplanes. Go ahead.
You were involved in every one of those reauthorizations, and you know better than anybody else.
That's right.
That they've not worked. They've failed every single time. I think there's some in this room that might say, and I won't point them out, that 25 years ago there were 4 or 5 layers of management at the FAA. Today there are 9 or 10. That's what we do across the system in government. We say we're going to reform something, and we just put a couple more layers in there. We never take the system down and rebuild it. And that's what you do when you have a failed system. You take it out, you say we're going to do something different, and again, we've got lots of ability to look around the world to see who's worked and who hasn't worked. Mr. Brown, I think you made a very great point. Something that I believe in, and part of my passion for this is to get the certification right. We are the leaders in the world. We invented aviation. But you said something else very important. When you can't go to market with your products because of this certification process, the competition's nipping at your heels. Well, if we don't fix certification, they're not just going to nip at your heel. They're going to take big chunks out of the back of your leg, and eventually they're going to cause you real problems in the marketplace. So this certification is critical to this reform that I'm putting forward. And when you look at what the MITRE Corporation said in their report, first of all, they interviewed 6 of the different CAAs around the world, and was unanimous, stating that the separation of CAA from air traffic control provision was worth it. Among the benefits expressed are an increase in focus by the regulator and the ANSP, the focus on safety by the regulator and the ANSP in improved efficiency. That's what I'm talking about here. If you separate them, you make the FAA focus on their core mission, and that's safety and that's certification. Now they're running this big organization, and they're doing a lousy job of it. And again, when I point my finger at the FAA, as my mother always told me, there's 3 fingers pointing back, and that's the Congress, OMB, the administration. This is an opportunity to take it out and let it function like it has been able to around the world. And getting certification and right is absolutely paramount in what I'm trying to accomplish, what we hope to be accomplished in this reform. And with that, I yield to Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I may say so, especially under my colleagues on the other side, structural reform has always proved very difficult. Almost all the structural reforms that have been made in the United States have been made by Democrats, and they're not calling for structural reform as we've just done with the Affordable Health Care Act. I have a question. It could be Mr. Poole, it could be Mr. Reason. It is a question that is a rising issue, and one that I have requested a hearing on. It has to do with airplane noise. When I say a rising issue, I mean all over the United States. Here in my own jurisdiction, and I represent the people of the nation's capital, but so much so across the nation that we formed a Quiet Skies Coalition, a bipartisan coalition, to respond to issues that, by the way, NextGen is just left right out there. NextGen, we're making progress in the air. On the ground, people are complaining. And of course, as a result of those complaints, I've been able to have the FAA come to see me. I've asked for a hearing by this committee, and I would like to get some responses about how this private corporation might respond to an issue like Quiet Skies. So who would my constituents and the constituents of my colleagues call if they had noise complaints? Mr. Reason, Mr. Poole.
My understanding, Congresswoman, is that this would still be the FAA as the safety regulator that would have to approve procedures or deny new procedures. And so if procedures are changed so that noise goes up in a community impact, it would be the FAA's jurisdiction to say yes or no, or how to modify it. It would not be the corporation's discretion to just unilaterally do those things.
Did you have?
If the gentleman
Yes.
yield, I can answer that question
Yes,
also.
sir.
Yes.
Gentlelady
Yes,
yield?
yes, sir, I will. But it will not take from my time, I
Mr. Poole
hope.
is absolutely correct. If there's a noise issue or flight patterns change, there's a NEPA process and major federal actions that the FAA will continue to have after this transaction. Again, let me dispel the notion. This organization is not going to control the airspace. It's going to operate in the airspace with the FAA control over it. And so they have to go through this federal process by the NEPA, which the FAA sets up a review process and approves significant airspace changes. So if there's, and especially related to metroplexes, major large-scale airspace redesign projects, they're going to have to go to the FAA, conduct a NEPA review, and any action taken will have to, again, be approved through the FAA. So once again, this is not just giving away willy-nilly the airspace. We will still, not only will we own the airspace, we'll still have an oversight over the airspace.
I thank the chairman for his response, and I've never heard of anything so bureaucratic in my life. In fact, I can't understand why we could leave one part of this operation under government control and take the other part, even though both are vital to all we do in the skies. I've never heard of efficiency being, and by the way, I hope my time wasn't taken because the chairman had an intervention, which I think was appropriate. So I don't understand how you could bifurcate the system, expect it to be more efficient, expect it to be more safe. Now, let me take an elephant in the room off the table. I will do it, if I may, by asking Mr. Rinaldi. Have you received any assurances from any of the proponents of this bill concerning collective bargaining, pensions, other workers' rights? Because otherwise, I see a fresh controversy on top of the many controversies this bill has already given us. Mr. Rinaldi.
Thank you for the question, Madam. At this time, there is no bill in front of us, so there's nothing I can compare it to. In the 2016 AIR Act, there was strong language that gave us a fair bargaining process, and that was in there, and also a robust transition period that will allow us to keep everything we have and keep the workforce whole.
I take it you would insist upon that in any
Absolutely.
change.
That's bullet number 2 of reform.
Thank you very much.
I yield to the gentlelady an extra
Yes.
30 seconds since I took some of your time.
That's all right. With that question, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. And with that, Mr. Barletta is recognized for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address some comments made by Mr. Brown. Mr. Rinaldi, you are one of the foremost experts on aviation and air traffic safety in the world. Would you support a legislative proposal that jeopardizes safety?
Absolutely not. That's our first core principle.
Would you support a proposal that jeopardized national security?
Absolutely not.
Would you support a proposal that further weakened our ability to modernize the aviation system?
Absolutely not.
Finally, do you support the air traffic control proposal in the AIR Act last year?
I did, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Poole, some have suggested that ATC reform is a giveaway of assets. We understand that taxpayers have already paid for them in fuel, ticket, and cargo taxes. If a new entity had to buy them, won't the same people pay twice?
That's correct, Congressman. They have been paid for by aviation excise taxes over the years. And all we're not talking about selling the system or giving it away. We're talking about transforming the existing air traffic organization into a better organizational model that would be insulated from the travails of the federal budget and able to operate as it should be, like a business paid for by its customers.
Dr. Robine, as a public policy expert, what is your response to such an allegation?
The assets should be transferred at no cost.
Yep.
It's been handled different ways. In the Canadian model, there was some payment for it. I can certainly see the argument that Bob makes. I mean, I think if that were the only debate, I think then we would be making real progress if we could agree on everything except what the dollar price on the assets is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barletta. Mr. Sires is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, my colleague said he takes the plane home every week. I take the train home every week, and it's safe or broken. But I don't expect you to say anything, Mr. Scoville. My issue is, I have problems when we get compared to Canada. Big problems. You know, we look at
Mr.
that.
Sayers, can you speak more directly into the mic? We didn't quite hear you.
I have to eat it. It's like you're getting close.
Like you're going to kiss.
I have a problem when we get compared to Canada. It reminds me of the argument with the health bill. They have a great health system. We don't. Canada only has 40 million people. We have 350 million people. It's a lot easier to set up a health system for a country that only has 40 million people. I have some fears regarding this. They have 40 towers. We have 500 towers. Obviously, can you assure me that if we go this route, that we're not too large to fail? Because I also have a concern regarding the airlines. I think the airlines are getting so big that it's very difficult to manage. And I raised that issue the other day when we had a hearing here. Can you assure me that my fears are wrong, that this big effort, I am wrong about it? Well, I'll start with Commissioner Mr. Brown.
I love flying in Canada, and I love the country of Canada, but I do not.
Oh, I don't dislike the country of Canada.
Exactly. But I don't think the comparison of our national airspace and management system to Canada is anything other than an exercise in gleaning some observations. But it's not proper to directly compare. I mean, for sure, in our system, we're driving a much more substantial portion of our economy out of the aviation sector and the airspace that supports it. I mean, we have 10 times more pilots, 50,000 flights a day. It's a wholly different organization. So for me, when I think about Canada, I believe that they made a choice that they thought suited their purposes with the role of aviation in its infrastructure. But we're faced with entirely different objectives here. And as far as I'm concerned, the system that we've been living in has done a masterful job of adjudicating all the interests of stakeholders, all the interests of our expansive country and the states that are in it and their needs. And so I can applaud things they've done that have worked for their country, but I also very much applaud things we've done in our country. And I would take exception to one thing Ms. Robine said, which is she characterized our system as a laggard. That is just false. We have the technology deployed in our system today that no other country can rival. We lead in our NextGen initiative. So, you know, I'm pretty proud of where we are. And by the way, I know it because I fly it. It's not a mystery and it's not a theory.
Thank you. Mr. Poole, can you answer?
Yeah. First of all, Canada's system is the second largest in the world in terms of flight operations. So it's the best comparator we have. You know, we are 9 times bigger in terms of flight activity. But their model has worked extremely well for 20 years. It's not too big to fail, and neither would ours be. If you go to the credit markets, the people who finance revenue bonds for these, they give investment-grade ratings to the Brits, the Germans, the Australians, the Canadians, because they have a dependable user fee revenue stream that you can basically bank on. And neither NATS nor NAV Canada declared bankruptcy. Both were hit hard by 9/11 because of the North Atlantic traffic. NATS was brand new and got an additional investment from their 2 main owners, the British government and the airline group. NAV Canada simply raised their rates somewhat, maybe I think it was 10 or 15% for a couple of years, and built up their reserve fund. And since then, they have a substantial reserve fund in case of another serious downturn that they can work through without having to
Mr. Scoville, can you just add? I got 30 seconds left.
Sure. As you know, my office looked at the air traffic control organizations for the other 4 countries. And we were told by officials in those organizations that they considered part of their borrowing authority to be leverageable or to be recognized by private lenders because ultimately, should something drastic go wrong, the government would step in behind them. I'm not representing that that would be the case here. that's your policy call to make. I'm simply relaying what officials for other air traffic control organizations have told us about their systems.
So in those 4 countries, they were on the hook? Is that what you're saying?
Conceivably,
Yes, sir.
they may be. There'll be policy calls for their legislatures and executive branch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Meadows for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Poole, let me follow up a little bit on what you were just talking about in terms of the Canadian system versus the air traffic control system here in the United States, because there are people that would say, well, we're 10 times the size of that in Canada. And so as you look at that larger size, let's talk about scalability. Is there any way that you can look at the scalability of the Canadian model versus what we would employ here and make some conclusions?
Sure, sure. First of all, we already have the scale. We're not talking about building from scratch an air traffic system. We already have the scale, the facilities, the technology.
So what you're saying is
about an organizational
because of
model.
what we already have in place, that
Right.
we can make better
We can
comparisons.
easily transition to a different governance model and a different funding model, and hopefully that will lead over time to an organizational culture that is more innovative, that can innovate and implement things faster than the large bureaucracy at FAA that Inspector General reports for 25 years have said continually fail to manage programs properly. They take far longer than they were scheduled. NAV Canada has a superb track record on that. If you scale up NAV Canada's capital investment, annual capital investment to our size, and say what would we be investing if we had their system, they're accomplishing all their modernization for, in equivalent terms, half of what we spend on capital investment.
Hold on, let me make sure I understand that. They're actually improving their system for half of the cost that we're
Yes, sir.
spending?
Demonstrated fact.
Mr. Scoville, would you agree with that? Because I saw you shaking your head yes on a lot of the things he was saying. Don't ever play poker, by the way, but go ahead.
Wouldn't dream of it.
Yeah.
Hey, no, and if I was shaking my head, it wasn't necessarily to agree or to assent. My office, quite frankly, hasn't examined that part of NAV Canada's operation. We don't know the degree to which their capital improvement program might compare against ours scaled up.
All right, so when will NextGen be completed, Mr. Scoville? We've had this is not your first rodeo, nor mine, so at what point will NextGen be completed? Because we continue to allocate unbelievable sums of money, and I hear, at best, ambiguous dates of when it will be completed. So what does the Inspector General's office say?
Well, let me say first, FAA's estimate is 2030 at a cost of $36 billion, split between government and private industry.
But would you agree that this has been one of the few times that we can see that even under this best-case scenario, we continue to exceed an unlimited budget?
I'd have to say we don't know. We don't know what the total cost might be, nor do we know what the completion date will be. It's important to note, though, that NextGen...
But do you not see why that would be a problem for somebody that's a fiscal hawk like me, that we continue to allocate money with no end in sight?
Absolutely.
All right, Mr. Brown, let me come to you. I'm a little confused because you seem like you're a business guy. Are you a business guy?
I would certainly think so.
Okay, well, as a business guy, and I'm one too, are you suggesting that we need more federal control?
I'm suggesting that we have a system that's delivered incredible.
That's not what I asked. There's a great answer to a question I didn't ask. Are you suggesting that we need more federal control?
I'm suggesting our control is proper.
All right, so let's talk about general certification, something you probably know, and it's one of my sweet spots being from North Carolina. Would you say that we need more federal control in the certification process?
I think what we have is proper.
So you don't want it to be more streamlined?
But that's not the same as reducing control. That's about efficiency.
Well, it is. It is about regulations. So at some point, you have to transfer that. So let me go and let me tell you where I'm concerned with. We've got NextGen that may or may not get done by 2030. We continue to spend billions of dollars. In fact, I have stakeholders who continue to implement it from a stakeholder standpoint, and from a federal government standpoint, we're lagging behind. We actually have monies that have been allocated for NextGen that get kind of pilfered over to maintain legacy computer systems under the FAA. I have under good authority that we're doing that. And so as we look at that, why would you suggest that the federal government can do something more efficiently than perhaps private stakeholders?
You know, my calculus...
Can the federal government run your business better than you do?
I would hope not.
I would hope not either. So why would you suggest that they can do that here?
Well, because we're talking about a range of interests here that's much larger than my business. I mean, my business, I get to pick my product, I get to pick my customers, I get to decide what I think the value proposition is. I get course corrected by competition.
And it's efficient that way, right?
Yeah, but
so what if we had stakeholders who were making the same exact decisions that you're making with some parameters that are out there? Wouldn't you think that that would be more efficient?
Actually, you've outlined my top concern, which is that if this organization picks their customers and picks their service level and picks their product, they're no longer going to.
But the chairman's already said that that can't happen. We have an airspace that is available to everybody.
Gentlemen's time's expired.
Thank you for
Mr. Brown, you can finish if you wish.
I believe that I've made my point, which is that the thing about this enterprise, one of the things that I'm concerned with, is that it's a coalition of stakeholders with a shared purpose, which is to serve their own ends. And the thing that I like about the federal role in our airspace today is that it adjudicates an enormous diversity of needs in this community, whether it's the Alaskan pilot who's flying kids to school, or whether it's my business in Ohio or Air Tractors in Olney, Texas. They all have a seat at the table. And this has been demonstrated in this room today.
My time is expired. I appreciate it. Thank the chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Johnson for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm probably like most Americans, and what we really want out of the air traffic control system is safety, safe operation. And Mr. Scoville, in your testimony, you stated that since 1958, the FAA has overseen the safe operation of the busiest and most complex air traffic system in the world. And you stated during your testimony that there have been no commercial aviation accidents over the past few years. Do you believe, sir, that the American-controlled airspace is the safest airspace in the world?
I haven't looked at all the others, sir, but I would say it's definitely safe. We're in the golden era of aviation safety right now.
Well, we're in the golden era, and I think, Mr. Rinaldi, you mentioned that we are the gold standard of air traffic control in the world. Did you not?
We are, sir. The largest, safest, most efficient.
And Mr. Brown, you fly you put in 500 hours a year minimum flight time, and you are strongly committed to the concept that our airspace is safe and that the operations that make it safe are up to par, and it's joyful to fly under that system.
I agree, and most pilots will tell you it's one of the most amazing experiences you can have, and it's something the government does extremely well.
Now, Mr. Poole, you would not disagree with that, would you?
No, I don't disagree at all.
We have a safe air traffic control system.
Right, but we're paying a price.
I'm going to get to that in a second. I mean, we're safe. And we've been safe since 1958 under FAA control. And the argument is being made that we need to change that. Mr. Brown, I think I heard from both you and Mr. Rinaldi the concept of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Mr. Scoville, I heard you in terms of there have been some FAA reforms that have not achieved the expected outcomes in the areas of personnel acquisition and organizational reforms. But those failures don't lead you to the conclusion that the air traffic control system should be privatized, correct?
Not respectfully, I don't believe that's my call to make. The Congress and the administration are the policymakers, the decision makers. I'm trying to present information for your consideration in making those decisions.
Thank you. And Mr. Poole, you are an advocate for privatization. You are an advocate to turn the air traffic control system over to the free markets. Your your website for the Reason Foundation states that the Reason Foundation is committed to advancing the values of individual freedom and choice, limited government, and market-friendly policies. So I'm assuming that you would be of the mind, as stated by the chair of the committee, that government is the problem and not the solution. And so therefore you want to take the federal government or the FAA out of this equation, which has been so safe for Americans
May I
since
respond?
at least 1958. And Mrs. Robin, you agree with him, and you say that, first of all, the air traffic control system can be performed or can be run more effectively by a non-governmental entity. And you also say that government is poorly suited to run
Yes.
the air traffic control system,
Yes.
despite the comments that we've heard from Mr. Scoville, Mr. Brown, and Mr. Rinaldi, and the clear fact that we haven't had, I mean, our airspace is safe. But you say that
Could I respond,
you
please?
say that it could be done better.
It-
Why do you say that?
Because if we wanted to have the safest system possible, we would keep
We don't have it now.
would keep all
We don't
plane-
have the
if we wanted to
safest-
have a
we don't have the safest
if
system
you
now?
wanted to have perfect
Isn't it,
safety,
okay, well, let
you
me
would
ask you
leave
this question.
that-
Isn't it a fact
safe-
that we have the safest air traffic control system in the world right now?
We have a system that is operated and regulated by the same entity.
Isn't it a good one?
Isn't
it a good one, though?
The gentleman's
not-
time has
that
expired, but
is-
if the gentleman wishes to
we are
allow the witness
we are
answer.
not in compliance.
Would you
If-
hold,
if
Ms.
we
Robine,
wanted-
1 second?
Well-
Gentleman's time has expired. If you want, though, I'll allow her to finish, answer a question or not. It's up to you.
Please respond.
Ms.
If
Robine.
we wanted to have zero accidents, we would have the air traffic control system keep all planes on the runway. You would have no planes in the air. That would guarantee perfect safety. That's obviously not what you want. You want a system that contributes to the economy while being safe. We
That's
have
not
a
the kind of
we
system
have-
that we
The
have.
agreement was, gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Robine, thank you very much for answering the question. With that, I recognize Mr. Woodall for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since my friend from Georgia and I share a county back home, I'll just pick up where he left off with Ms. Robin. I appreciate your written testimony, because I think so often, as perhaps your exasperation shows, we just have
Speak
a
into
tough
the
time-
mic,
We have a tough
Mr.
time
Woodall.
talking to each other about these.
Speak directly into the mic. Can't hear everyone.
After you've given that advice to every member of the panel, you'd have thought I'd have internalized that, Mr. Chairman. I cannot pull my box closer, though, as I can pull the chair closer. Ms. Robin, I want you to help me with the language to talk about this issue, because it does seem when we talk about change so often we end up with it's Mr. Weber's big head that I can't get past. I can't move both the microphone and Mr. Weber. Can I thank you? It's just between me and Ms. Robin here that we're working on it. It's a physical
Mr.
manifestation.
Chairman, do I get equal time?
It's a physical manifestation of your head. It's not an ego issue. It's actually a physical. Help me with the language about how we talk about this, because I've been to see the NAV Canada operation, and thinking about Mr. Poole's reference to scalability, it does seem like the successes they've had, we could have in an exponential fashion, and it's not as if this is the chairman's idea or the president's idea. This is something that policy wonks have been talking about for decades. Help me create this conversation in a language. I sit on the budget committee. I hear my friend Mr. DeFazio say, well, you know, if only we could fund the system better and deal with sequestration and get Congress to work better. Yeah, those are the kind of the issues we've been working on for 3 or 4 decades, and we've only finished the budget process on time 4 times in 40 years. So help me talk about this in a nonpartisan way.
The FAA is two-hatted. It does two very different things. It regulates all aspects of aviation, and that is an inherently governmental activity. You cannot write a contract that that makes it possible for the private sector to carry that out. It is simply, it requires judgment calls that the private sector can't make. It also operates the air traffic control system. There is nothing government, that is not inherently governmental. That is operational. That is no different than when GSA goes to the private sector and has them build a building. It is not an inherently governmental activity. The idea that, yes, the safety, the regulatory part of the FAA needs help. That part needs help. I agree with Mr. Brown. The idea, though, that in order to fix that, you don't spin off the non-governmental part, that's illogical to me. That's exactly what you want to do. Spin off the non-inherently governmental part so that the FAA can focus on, stick to its knitting, focus on the regulatory function.
Well, let's talk about that just for a moment, because I agree with Mr. Brown. The American taxpayer, the American flying public, has invested an amazing amount of time and treasure into building what is the busiest airspace in the, on the planet. So when we talk about changing that from a governmental function to a, well, I don't know anybody who talks about a private function. I hear them talk about a corporatized function, a cooperative function. Tell me what that looks like.
Well, so we, in the Clinton administration, we proposed moving into a government corporation because that was the only model that existed. And it's not, and the problem with that model works very well in many parts of the world. But in this country, government corporations are politicized, and they cannot function as businesses. And so the NAV Canada has come up with a model that takes it out of government altogether, and that is appropriate. It works in theory, and more important, it's worked in practice beautifully.
Well, the business folks that I talk with back home often prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. And I can only imagine the strain it puts a private operator under to say we're going to yank the pendulum back and forth with the political winds. But it was the conclusion of the Clinton administration that the best way to avoid the political winds in this space was this spinoff proposal?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, this was something proposed early on. It came out of a Blue Ribbon Commission, one of many that has looked at this issue. And we proposed it in 1995, and it was dead on arrival on Capitol Hill.
Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Brown was right when he talked about all of the amazing economic developments and successes that have been the product of our second-to-none airspace system. I hope that we can follow this pattern to keep the politics out and move us on to best in world space.
You're absolutely right, and again, as I said earlier, there's no way I want to screw up with the economic impact that the aviation industry across the board has. So with that, yield to Mr. Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Brown, it seems the FAA is already in the process of implementing much of the next-gen infrastructure you're calling for. We've been told that 2020 deadlines will be met. As a pilot, sir, can you tell us about the next-gen technology that is already online and how you're using it? And do you believe we need to replicate these systems through privatization?
Great question. I was just thinking about this about a month ago or so. I took off from Piqua, Ohio, population 20,000, from a small airport and flew to Albany, Georgia, a small town with a very vital aviation manufacturer that's a global leader and a big exporter. I flew point to point. Because of GPS navigation, I had en route weather on the way, and I shot a WAS approach into Albany, Georgia, precision to the numbers. Now, these two towns, in the grand scheme of our national airspace, have been treated to the resources to build two global leaders in their space, and they have the airport infrastructure to thrive. And I look at that as a perfect example of how government, in this case, is working for the economy, because without that kind of infrastructure and the technology that's driving the flying to and from those places, I don't think these businesses would be located in Piqua, Ohio, or Albany, Georgia. And frankly, I think that's a victory for the people.
Thank you, sir. Lastly, this is a general question. I'm very concerned that, as introduced, this new private air traffic control panel does not include one of the largest users of U.S. airspace, the DoD. I'd like to hear from any of the witnesses their view on how this will impact the close coordination that currently takes space and takes place, and what impact there will be to our national security.
I'll answer that. Let me start by saying, although I spent 3 years in the Pentagon, that air traffic control was not part of my portfolio. I did, however, work very closely with the people in the Air Force who have the day-to-day liaison with the FAA. I worked with them on issues of interference of wind turbines and military and long-range radar. The Department of Defense has huge equities in the national airspace system. They manage 15% of the national airspace. They have 15,000 aircraft, which is more than the airline industry put together. They depend heavily as a user on the air traffic control system, and they support the spinoff of the air traffic control system. And there is a letter from Secretary Mattis to Secretary McCain, Senator McCain, stating that it has to be done carefully so as to protect the arrangements that are currently in place. It's complicated, but bottom line is that this is not inconsistent with national security.
Sure. Yes, sir.
This is an issue that has come up in every one of the 60 countries that has corporatized their system in one form or another. Australia today has a joint project between the Australian military and Air Service Australia to modernize the overall basic air traffic software. It's being developed jointly, will be used jointly with side-by-side military and civilian controllers. There's side-by-side military and civilian controllers in NATS in the UK working together. This is pretty much a routine function now, this military, and in fact there's an annual conference on military air traffic control that is co-sponsored by the Air Traffic Control Association in conjunction with the ATCA's own national conference each year. So this is an issue, as Dorothy Robine said, it needs to be handled very carefully to be sure that all the current procedures are incorporated, but it's not considered a problem anywhere in the world that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate the gentleman's question. I want to offer for the record a letter from Secretary of Defense Mattis. Some have said the DOD has come out in opposition to this. Well, this letter does not say that, and any suggestion is that it's false. Secretary Mattis has indicated his support for removing ATC service out of the FAA in a letter he wrote to Senator McCain, who requested that. So without objection, I want to offer this for the record. And with that, Mr. Rikita.
I thank the chairman. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. Starting with you, Mr. Brown, knowing that you're a private pilot and a member of Gamma and active in AOPA and so on and so forth, and for the record and for the committee members, knowing that you fly 400 hours a year, which is about 4 times the average general aviation pilot, you're familiar with the system. Do you believe that general aviation pilots have a right to access airports of any size, of any...
Not only do I believe that, I experience it.
Yeah, on a daily basis. Talking to the microphone, please. Thank you. Should they be denied access to any airport?
No, not on principle.
Can you talk about the danger that would pose to the aviation ecosystem that we're all a part of if that were to happen?
That is an existential threat to the business. Access is everything to the pilot that buys equipment I make and the airplanes they fly.
Right. And every one of those pilots pays into the system, right?
Yes.
How?
Through the fuel tax.
Yeah. And it's more than adequate for what we use of the system, right?
Yes, and it's not bureaucratic, and it's real time, and there's no bureaucracy associated with it.
Right. And it's not that we want to fly into international airports every day or cause any problems, but the fact is we have a right to do that because we paid into the system. And sometimes, like an example of your customers, you may need to access an airport like that.
Correct.
Right. And so what are the dangers of a board made up of all members or some members of the ecosystem where, you know, board governance suggests that you can have control of a board with as little as 30% of the seats? What dangers does that propose to general aviation then, if this was all board controlled in terms of access?
One concern I have is that on such a board, you would have centers of gravity that would begin to overwhelm minority voices of any sort and preclude the arrival of new entrants that might have a radical impact in our economy.
Absolutely, which begs the question, which makes the point that we have it's good to have a disinterested party in this, or a referee or an umpire to decide these issues like we have right now in the FAA. Or if the members of this witness table who agree with the chairman's proposal here would really want privatization, if they would propose a plan that actually does that. Because right now, the proposal, at least in the AIR Act, and who knows what we're going to see here when this language is produced, doesn't do that. I mean, I used to be the Secretary of State of Indiana. I know about privatizing government assets. We received $3.8 billion when we leased the Indiana Toll Road with Governor Mitch Daniels. What we didn't do is give a monopoly away. We didn't take the toll road and give it to an interested party or a board made up of interested parties. We put it out for bid. So if we really want to privatize something, which is apparently the proposal here, why aren't we talking about something like that? We didn't give the Indiana Toll Road to the truckers and say, oh, I'm sure you'll take care of the cars too, and I'm sure you won't limit access to the on and off ramps that exist along the Indiana Toll Road, especially when you truckers want to get steel to or from one of those mills up in Northwest Indiana. Because it wouldn't work. It doesn't make sense. Just like this board made up of interested stakeholders, to use Congressman Meadows' term for it, won't work either. Mr. Rinaldi, if I can paraphrase your testimony, it seems like a lot of it was focused on funding and sequester and government shutdown and the fits and starts that go along with that, and I completely agree with you. You also heard Ranking Member DeFazio say that, and it's accurate, 97% of FAA funding is on its own. It's not from the general fund. And there was a suggestion made that, well, one way to solve this and your problems that you bring up in your testimony is to just take it off budget. Now, I'm vice chairman of the budget. I'm not here to necessarily say that that's the right answer or that I support it, but isn't that an answer? You said there's certainly more than one answer to this problem that we're talking about in this hearing today.
That is a legitimate
So
answer.
we could take care of all that simply by taking this off budget, where again 97% of the funding isn't coming from the general fund anyway.
Yes.
Right.
That's a good answer.
Chairman, my time has expired.
I thank the gentleman. Where am I? Ms. Frankel is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I'll just start off by being a little snarky. You know, we put a businessman in charge of the country, and all I can say is OMG about that. And every agency would like to be exempted from sequestration, and I have a solution for that, which is to privatize those of us who are not doing our job. All right, so enough for the humor. Listen. I am not a mean person, but just in the issue of transparency. And first, I want to thank you all, and not to impugn anyone's integrity, but we have a list of different organizations or people who are for the privatization, who are against it. Different airlines are for, some are against. Consumer groups for and against. Could you just tell me here, do any of you consult with any of these or get paid and consult with any organizations or discussing employment with them? Those of you who are in the public sector included. Okay, just wave your hand if it's...
No.
No.
No, okay. All right, thanks. So I'm trying to simplify this, which is probably not a smart thing to do. But I'm trying to understand it. It sounds to me like there were a number of reasons those of you who would support a change in the system. One has to do with a consistency in the funding. Is that correct? I know the air traffic controllers did really emphasize that. Then I think another issue was trying to move more efficiently towards a more modern safety technology? Is that one of them? And then I think one of the issues was not having the regulators separated from the operators. That was it. Is there another issue there that I'm missing?
Well, yeah, there is another big issue,
Okay, which one
and
is that?
that is the organizational culture of FAA, which gets into the procurement problems, the chronically over budget, late delivery of things, not getting productivity out of new technology in the way that it should be done.
Okay,
That's a big problem.
All right, good. Thank you. I don't know why that skipped my mind, but that's the one I had my next question about, okay? Which is, what kinds of things do you think this new organization could do that the government is not able to do? I mean, what will you be skipping, and what would be the potential unintended consequences, which I would like those who are for this also, a movement to, give us your opinion on that.
Well, I'll start. I mean, one thing would be to be able to hire and pay the best talent from private industry as program managers and as expert engineers and software people. There are good people in the FAA, but they're hamstrung in a system that has a lot of basically career lifers who are happy to be in a process that's very time-consuming and that has numerous people who can say no at many points along the way, drags out the process, and if you have people who are not performing well, it's very difficult to get rid of civil servants.
Does anyone want to defend the honor of the civil servants?
I will be happy to.
Yes, go ahead.
As I said in my opening statement, we have by far the best aviation professionals in the world working for the FAA. Aside from the funding stream, one of the things we would also like to see fixed is something that Ranking Member DeFazio also brings up, is the procurement requirement process and the multi-agency oversight, which then puts us into a bureaucratic-laden process of requirements and procurement, and it delays our process of implementing new technology.
I would guess that bureaucracy, which can drive everybody crazy, was probably got in part there because of abuses, I'm going to guess, and to try to avoid that, right?
I think every time we have a hearing, there's more oversight that goes into it, so it kind of self-fulfills itself every time we have a hearing of something that's not working right within government.
And, I'm going to have 15 seconds. The contract towers, what happens to them?
Well, we represent 94 of those contract towers and the members that work there. It's very important to us to keep service open to all facilities across the country, all airports, and to continue to have a very diverse system, whether it is big city or rural America.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank you, Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, I'm not familiar with all that new words on the computers. OMG, does that mean, oh man, he's good? With that, I yield to Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this important issue. I've had the opportunity to visit some control towers, and the first thing I would like to say is to acknowledge that we have some amazing men and women that are working in our air traffic control towers doing an excellent job. And we have an air traffic control system that works, and the proof is in the pudding. You can see it working every day. And I'm relatively new to Congress, and I am new to this committee, but I have a unique background, having practiced as a professional engineer for nearly 25 years. Much of my work involved analyzing processes and technologies and helping my clients stay on the cutting edge. I've seen organizations that failed to even embrace technology, and they usually went out of business. I've seen organizations that embraced but failed to implement technology, and they usually went out of business. Now, to be successful in business, you have to not only embrace new technology, but you have to implement it properly. Now, ATC is not going to go out of business regardless of the technology it embraces or implements because, quite frankly, it is too critical to fail. It's been said in this meeting today that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, however, I believe this isn't a question of a broken ATC, an ATC that doesn't work, or even an ATC that refuses to embrace new technology. This is a question of how to implement the best technology and operate the safest and most efficient system in the world so that our airline passengers and general aviators get the maximum benefits. I'm studying our existing system. I'm visiting installations and learning as much as I can about the latest technology. I can confidently say that even though technology may be embraced, it's not being successfully implemented as well in the U.S. as it is relative to other systems. I'm from a rural district. I've got one contract manned tower in my district. There's lots of general aviation and lots of aerospace manufacturing located at the rural airports in my district. Mr. Brown even mentioned airports like these in his testimony. I'm thinking of an airport I visited just a few weeks ago in Mena, Arkansas, that has a lot of aerospace manufacturing there. It's in the mountains, and it's not, the radar can't see it. They had a radio tower that got blown down in a tornado a few years ago that still hasn't been fixed. So if you're trying to take off from Mena, you have to pull out on the taxi and call up the air traffic control on your cell phone and try to get clearance to take off. So, but they've still found a way to make it work. But the point is, the last thing I want to hurt is rural airports or service to rural America. I want to see it improved. And Mr. Rinaldi, some of the opponents of ATC reform claimed that new service providers would be able to deny access to sovereign airspace and small community and general aviation airports. From the perspective of those actually providing air traffic control, how do you respond to those claims?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the question. Air traffic controllers have a very simple philosophy when it comes to providing service to all users. It's first come, first serve. And when a general aviation aircraft enters into our airspace, or whether it is a commercial airline, it's to expedite their process as safely as possible. And so we provide service to all users of the system.
And Mrs. Robin, I first want to say I appreciate your testimony, and in a number of hearings that have been held by the Aviation Subcommittee leading up to this, we've heard some pretty inflammatory rhetoric intended to scare small communities about the future of their commercial air service. I've got two EAS airports, one of them in my hometown, but two of them in my district, as well as numerous smaller ones. So I have a vested interest in making sure this is not the case. Do you think a more innovative and agile ATC provider will ultimately provide more options to more communities, such as the usage of remote towers, which I've seen some of those, and it's amazing technology?
I do, yes, and I think that's critical. I don't understand this assumption that some are making that this entity, a corporatized entity, would somehow be a threat to small communities and rural airports. Air traffic control is a network. The nature of networks is that the bigger they are, the lower the cost is. It's relatively inexpensive to add a node to that airport, particularly if you can go to use a technology like remote towers. This has been an argument, the small communities argument has been made. It was made in opposition to airline deregulation. It was made in opposition to trucking deregulation. It is part of the playbook of people who oppose change. All of those changes, I would argue, have been very, very good for our economy. Small communities, I do not see any reason that they would be hurt by this. It is not in the airline's interest, or certainly not in the controller's interest. It is not in government's interest. It is not in the stakeholders' interest to have that happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lipinski is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's very important that, and I've talked with the chairman, and he has always continued to ask me to have an open mind on this, and I have. I think it's going to be very important to see the text of the bill to have a better understanding of what exactly is in there. Ms. Norton had spoke earlier about concerns about noise around airports, and that's a major concern that that I have. I have Midway Airport in my district, O'Hare not too far away, and as the patterns flying in and out of those airports has changed in recent years, there's been a lot of constituents, excuse me, of mine who have had a lot of complaints, and we have gotten the FAA now to be more. They say they are going to do a better job of listening and paying attention to what some of these issues may be. My concern, I have great concern moving ahead, what exactly the rules are going to be in the future if we did have a ATC moved under a corporation. The chairman says that NEPA would still be would still apply, but I have concerns about what exactly is going to happen. Is the FAA, is the corporation going to propose the patterns, and then the FAA has to then have their say on that and improve them or not approve them, and that's a concern that that I have. Mr. Rinaldi, I don't know if you have any. The bill that we had last year, do you know anything about what that would have done?
Well, the regulatory and certification process would have stayed within the FAA, so it would still be ultimately the FAA overseeing noise complaints and new procedures.
Would they have the authority then to? Would they just be a back and forth with the corporation over it? The corporation propose, and the FAA then have to approve, or how would that work?
Hypothetically, it's hard to answer that question right now, but I will tell you, while we're moving forward with Metroplex and PBN in many cities, it is the FAA is going out and doing joint community meetings along with the users and the stakeholders to explain what we are trying to accomplish in making the skies greener, safer, with less noise. But keep in mind, as the technology makes it to be more precise on approaches, there are certainly winners and losers when it comes to noise. That is a fact, and that is a true fact.
And obviously, my concern is that to make sure that my constituents, those who are going to be in all around the country, those who are going to be impacted by these changes, are going to be able to have a say. And right now, their say is through us here in Congress, through the FAA, and I want to make sure that that occurs. But I want to move on to another question before I run out of time. I'm concerned that some of the estimates for the timeline for a new ATC corporation are nearly a decade. We heard earlier 5 to 7 years. And my concern is about air traffic controller hiring. Will this not, will there be troubling lack of accountability and transparency as this occurs and make ATC hiring and staffing difficult, if not almost impossible to do during this transition period, Mr. Rinaldi?
One of the things we would really have to see in the bill is a very robust transition period where we still have, we would seek a stable, predictable funding stream so that we can continue to hire and accomplish the goals of the agency while it's still under control, and if it was going to a not-for-profit federally chartered company at the same time, that it would be a robust transition period in enhancing the safety of the system at the same time, continuing to hire, train, and modernize the system.
The control of the Academy for Training Air Traffic Controllers, who would have that control?
I believe in the Air Act of 2016, that was left up to the transition on who would actually still control the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City.
Okay, so that was not laid out in there. It was.
I don't believe it was.
To be determined further on. All right, thank you very much. It's something that I look forward to seeing with the bill and the details, and look forward to maybe having another hearing at that point. But thank the chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Mr. Schmucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to pick up where my friend Mr. Westerman left off and further clarify some of the issues that that he raised. One is there seems to be some confusion in the debate about what we call use of airspace and who will and who won't be making decisions about that. And in fact, I believe that some are perhaps incorrectly conflating airline service business decisions and the provision of providing the ATC services. And Mr. Rinaldi, you specifically addressed that by saying that you simply provide the services to whoever shows up in the airspace, essentially. But I guess I'd like to further clarify that. Mr. Poole, maybe I'll ask you, could you please clarify to me that the new entity that's being proposed will simply provide those ATC services to any entity wishing to receive those services? And I'll put it in a slightly different way. Will this ATC entity decide where airlines fly?
Absolutely not, Congressman. Airlines will decide where they want to fly, and presumably the system will accommodate any desires that they have of where to fly. This, of course, includes air taxis, regionals, as well as major carriers. We're not privatizing the airspace. We would only be privatizing or corporatizing the provision of the air traffic services, including the financing of new facilities and new technology. But all of the safety regulation and ownership of the airspace remains with the federal government in the form of the FAA. That's very, very clear cut.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. Mr. Poole, I ask you another question. The district that I represent in Pennsylvania includes 3 smaller airports, no major international or domestic airport in the district, but each of these small airports serve a county and are critically important to their economic drivers in the county. And so there's concerns have been raised, and I just want to ask you directly about any potential impact of this system on the smaller airports. I have one in particular in the Chester County area of my district that has an application in for a control tower.
Right.
And it's just an example, but I guess I want to hear again. I want to be sure.
Right,
Do you think we will see under this program an improvement for small airports, and if so, how?
I do think there will be an improvement. For one thing, because of FAA funding limitations, we have this moratorium on new contract tower approvals that's been going on since fiscal 14. And the only way that could be lifted today is if there were a significant budget increase for FAA, or they cut out some other funding for other things like NextGen and so forth that nobody would really want to see. The best hope, I think, for small airports and expanding the reach of control towers is a better funded organization that is also one that adopts new technology that increases benefits and reduces costs, so that the contract tower benefit cost ratio can be higher for small airports that might not qualify today with a conventional several hundred-foot tall structure, but could easily afford a contract tower and actually get better service from it.
Thank you. One quick question, Mr. Brown. You asserted that non-governmental air service provider would somehow be outside of democratic oversight, I think is what you said. And just one point, just a few weeks ago, we had executives here from United, American, Southwest, and Alaska who were sitting right here in this room where you are and getting grilled by folks up here. Congress oversees the entire aviation sector, including regulated private businesses. So just like to hear, can you explain why you believe a regulated air traffic service provider would be outside of democratic oversight?
It's my understanding that this would be empowered as a business that can effectively decide what it invests in, how much it borrows, what technologies it picks, maybe what...
But still with congressional oversight.
Well, are we going to have a committee for how they spend their money and what they invest in and where they deploy PAPIs and VASIs and where they put up the next datacom tower? Because if we are, why would we carve it out?
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. That's what we have today. United States Congress, it's called, and it's not functioning well, and that's what we're trying to get away from. So it can operate more like you, Mr. Brown, operate, which, again, you have an extremely successful business, but you decide that based on business decisions, not based on whether Bill Schuster wants a tower or doesn't want a tower. So with that, I yield to, who's Mr. Duncan. So I'm sorry, no, we could, not Mr. Duncan. I don't know who's. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne is recognized. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to all this testimony and the different opinions, the American taxpayers, have invested more than $50 billion in the air traffic control system in just the last 20 years. Under the chairman's proposal to privatize ATC last year, the federal government would have handed over ATC assets worth billions of dollars to a private corporation free of charge. If the ATC corporation was to hit financial or operational difficulties and needed to be taken over by the government, it's my understanding, per the takings clause of the Constitution, that Congress would have to pay to reacquire the ATC assets. We would have to pay for what we gave away for free. What does the panel think about this? Mr. Scoville?
Thanks. As I mentioned earlier, I don't believe it's my role, sir, as Inspector General to express an opinion on a purely policy call like that. However, to your point about valuation of assets specifically, our work has led our duty each year to audit the department's financial statements, to include FAA's financial statements, has shown us that the net book value of FAA assets that might reasonably be considered for a transfer to a non-governmental agency at the end of the last FY amounted to $13.7 billion. Ideally, or probably a lesser figure than that would be actually transferred if the Congress and the administration were to agree to take air traffic control out of government then. But nonetheless, that's a policy decision for you to consider. A valuation of those assets in any event, whether it's with the request or requirement that the new entity pay back the government, an accurate valuation is still going to be required because potential lenders and borrowers are going to want to see what the value of collateral is that they're putting up their money against.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
I think people are trying to solve problems here, and I frankly respect the dialogue. I'm not a status quo guy. I actually think there are real opportunities to improve the management of the FAA, and I have found very often in the certification side they're willing to listen. But among the things I'm concerned about, besides equity in the system, is whether the logic makes sense in the risk-reward profile. I mean, this is a real question to me, and I'm just asking it as a business guy. I'm here because I make my living selling products into aviation. But the lineup that I'm concerned about is if we assure the workforce that the future is as they need it to be for the purposes of serving their interests, and we underwrite the risk of this enterprise more surely than anything else, I know that to be true, when we are perhaps enjoined in litigation with this enterprise when it's challenged on things that it does, and when we give up our assets, some $20 billion to do it, and empower a monopoly, when I look at that enterprise, I want it to report to the people, unequivocally. It's served us well for 50 years. It will serve us well in the future. And so I wrote in my testimony, this is a question of principle for me. It's not a question of challenging other members' objectives or motivations. It's an honest disagreement about the policy play here.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Poole?
Well, in the hypothetical event of a bankruptcy, which I guess is what you were talking about as a possibility, and you have a liquidation in a bankruptcy, in which case a takings clause thing I don't think would apply. Creditors would be the ones dealing with the bankruptcy situation, and they would potentially be in a position to look for a different operator to take over and restart the system.
But if the government, if there were no takers, if the government had to step back in.
Well, what if there are takers? I mean, the net effect of your scenario there is that we transfer $20 billion to a company who makes bad bets, and they end up owned by the Bank of New York. That's a bad outcome. those might be the credit providers.
They might be credit providers.
Mr. Rinaldi, in your testimony, you talked about the concern for your membership. Anytime anything's streamlined or could, if you think that your benefits and things are going to stay the same under that scenario, I got a bridge to sell you too. But could you answer the question? Oh, I'm sorry.
What was the question? What bridge do you want to sell me?
Well, that's not that question. The original question that I asked, that I laid out, but my time has expired. I guess you weren't listening.
No, I was listening.
I thank the gentleman. There are limits to all infrastructure, technologically and human, and because of that, we're taking a 5-minute break. I would encourage everybody to make it back to their seats. We're going to get started here in a minute. The committee will come to order. I now recognize the Vice Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as some people here will recall, Mr. Poole and I think others, I chaired the Aviation Subcommittee for 6 years from 1995 until 2001, and Speaker Gingrich asked me to hold the first hearings on the proposed Air Traffic Control Corporation. Ms. Robin, I think, will remember that, and at that point, I think almost everybody, maybe with the exception of Mr. Poole, was opposed to it and so forth. But Chairman Schuster, has done an amazing job now and has brought some groups and people on board that were not in favor of this proposal at the time. But I'm sorry that I didn't get to hear Mr. Rinaldi and Ms. Robin's testimonies because I had other meetings. But I do want to say to Mr. Brown that I was impressed by your testimony, and I can assure you that I think your people will tell you that general aviation has not had a stronger supporter than I've been, and I'm sure the chairman will do everything possible to make sure that general aviation's concerns are heard loud and clear in any proposal that we end up with in this regard. But Mr. Scoville, you've been with us several times before, and you know that I've had concerns for a long time about some of these costs and the delays and so forth. And so then I noticed in your testimony, you say, however, FAA has not fully identified the total cost, the number of segments, their capabilities, or completion schedules for any of the 6 programs. In addition, FAA has not determine when the transformational programs will start delivering benefits or how they will improve air traffic flow or controller productivity. These cost things concern me, and you told me in response to questions that I asked at a 2014 hearing, you stated, quote, "We are probably looking years beyond 2025, perhaps another 10 even, and we are probably also looking at total expenditures in an order of our magnitude 2 to 3 times that of the initial $40 billion estimate to achieve the original plan." I'm wondering, do you stand by those statements that you made in 2014, or what's the situation now? And then you heard Mr. Brown basically say that everything's going pretty good.
Thanks, Mr. Duncan. As part of your introduction, you mentioned your long service on the committee. I still wear with pride the label that you gave me at probably my very first appearance before the committee, where you said, Mr. Scoville, you're the committee's hired skeptic. So I appreciate that, and my staff does too, because that fits our role.
Well, you and I have been around for a long time.
Yes, we have. Thank you. I do stand by those numbers, and what I meant to convey when I said that was the uncertainty of the numbers at that point. The numbers appear to have changed a little bit recently because FAA's estimates have come to $36 billion, completion date thereabouts 2030 or so, but still the uncertainty remains because at least for the 6 transformational programs that have commonly taken the title of NextGen, FAA's segmentation practices in managing those acquisitions have not led to any kind of clear understanding as to total costs or ultimate completion date. So we're still very much in an uncertain environment with regard to those programs. It's clear what's happened over time, though, is that those programs have become part of a more general and rolling implementation of modernization efforts, to be sure. FAA, to its credit, has worked much more closely with industry over the last couple of years and the NAC to get their priorities down, and FAA has been working hard to execute on those. So I do want to be fair, certainly, to the agency when I say that. But cost and completion date still much uncertain.
All right. Ms. Robin, you said that your original proposal when you worked on it was dead on arrival. Is that, what do you think is, why do you think that was, and where do you think we are now? Tell me what you think is different now.
I think it was dead on arrival because it frankly imposed an additional financial burden on the on the users. At the time, more of the funding of the air traffic control system came from the general fund as opposed to ticket taxes. We, the Clinton administration, our highest priority was balancing the budget, and so our proposal entailed a bill for the users that was unacceptable. So I think for the airline industry, that was a problem. I think for House Democrats, it was much of what you hear today. It was an opposition to something that was seen as not privatization, but something like that. I think this is a great debate. I think we're making progress. We're arguing over the value of the assets that get transferred. I mean, there are proposals to create a government corporation. Admittedly, it would have the regulatory function as part of it, which is, I think, highly flawed. But I think we've advanced the debate.
Well, my time's gone by so quickly. But just quickly, I'd like to ask Mr. Brown. They tell me some 60 countries that have done some form of privatization, and we've visited them in New Zealand and certain other countries. Have you talked to some of the general aviation people in some of these other countries? Of course, I know general aviation is very small in many of those countries.
Yeah.
Have you visited or looked into that any?
I have, and I think those countries made choices they thought were sensible for their taxpayers and their public interests, and frankly, for the scale and scope of their aviation industries, which are quite small. And so, my reference point in many of those countries is that general aviation is already a minuscule part of the economy. People don't fly. They don't have the freedom to fly. They don't create pilots. They don't build airplanes. And so, in my mind, they're taking a function that isn't critical to their economy, and they're outsourcing it. In my mind, in our country, what we do with our national airspace is, in fact, an economic engine, and a critical one. And I think it works pretty darn well, and that's where the origin of my interest and my point of view come from.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Titus is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting what Ms. Robin just said. Her bill was dead on arrival because airlines wanted it, but they didn't want to pay for it. Now that they're getting it free, seem to be all in. Doesn't seem to be dead on arrival. I find that interesting.
No.
But the question I want to ask is to Mr. Poole. I want to go back. We hear a lot about the assets. Let's talk about the people who are involved. You, Mr. Poole, and the Reason Foundation and your donor network have been talking for decades about privatizing all aspects of government, not just the FAA. In fact, in 2010, you wrote a piece called For Downsizing the Government.org that was a project of the Cato Institute, and you talked about the need to privatize and commercialize air traffic system back then. One of the major arguments that you made was the cost of running the system, and in particular, you went into extensive detail about the history of air traffic controllers and the cost of salary and benefits to those professionals who operate the system. You noted that 2/3 of the FAA's operational expenses are due to what you called the high cost of labor. You've gone on to reference the efficiency of Canada, where they have downsized the system, shrunk the system, I think was the term, and cut down on the number of towers. So considering all that you have written on this issue, and now we have this bill before us, I want you to walk me through exactly how you're going to address the high cost of labor as you make this system more efficient.
Well, thank you for letting me clarify. What we've seen in countries such as Germany and Canada and others that have corporatized their systems is not downsizing the controller workforce. In many cases, in Canada in particular, the need was to increase the controller workforce, which was low because of decade or many years of underfunding by Transport Canada. The downsizing that could take place is in the middle management ranks, the bureaucracy, because it is so many layers and so convoluted that it extracts a high cost out of the users, whether they're paying aviation user taxes or actually direct user fees. That's where the need for looking at that cost is. It's in the middle management ranks of the bureaucracy, not in the day-to-day controller workforce that is undersized for the task that at hand today. We, as Paul Rinaldi has said, we're at a low point of certified professional controllers today, and that's partly because of the shutdown. The training academy was out of commission for nearly a year, and also because of some politicization of the selection process that has now been partly overturned thanks to Congress. So we do have problems, but it's not because it's not controllers. It's the bureaucracy.
I wish that reassured me, but when you talk about efficiency and cutting cost and high cost of labor and benefits and controllers are part of that system, I don't know that I believe that that's where you're going to stop, is at middle, so-called middle management. But I'd ask Mr. Rinaldi, he's sitting right there next to you, he represents these folks. It's not just you, a number of conservative media outlets keep talking about high labor costs, let's get more computers, let's have fewer people. So I would ask you, Mr. Rinaldi, just what assurances do you have that once your members are under control of a private system that's dominated by representatives of for-profit companies who are looking to run the system as cheaply as possible because it's about their bottom line. You heard they didn't want to pay for it before, but they're getting it free now. How do you know your members are going to be protected once this current contract is over?
Thank you, Madam Congressman. Great question. First of all, we have nothing in front of us to actually compare to see exactly what type of workers' protections would be in the new language. So anything I would say would be speculating. But I will tell you, we are a highly trained, highly skilled, highly efficient workforce. And we keep hearing about Canada, we keep hearing about the United States. Well, we run roughly 10 times the amount of traffic they do in Canada with only 5 times the amount of controllers. We are highly efficient. And I stand behind the work of the air traffic controllers in this country, and I put them against anybody else in the world because we are the best in the world.
I totally agree with that, and that's why I want to be sure they are protected under any kind of new system going forward.
Me too, and I'm with you.
And I would just say that I think Mr. Rinaldi said this before, under the AIR Act from last year, we got support from the air traffic controllers, as well as, if I could for the record, submit letters of support from, what's the first one? The NetJets Pilots, Southwest Pilots Association, the Allied Pilots Association, and NATCA. So I'd like to submit these letters for the record without objection, so ordered. And with that, I recognize Mr. Mitchell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses remaining through for a long day. Mr. Scoble, you note in your report that FAA reform efforts have not slowed the overall cost growth or improved the productivity. You talk about the fact that their budget between 96 and 2015 grew by 95%. You also, earlier, Mr. Hunter referenced that the hope is, I stress hope, the $36 billion will be the cost to get NextGen up, and sometime around 2030, it may come to fruition. I'm hoping to still be around at 2030. Let me ask you a question, Mr. Brown. Am I wrong, Mr. Scoble? That's accurately portrays your analysis?
Yes, it is. Correct.
Mr. Brown, like you, I'm a private business guy. I'm an aircraft owner. I've owned several aircraft. In fact, one of your props was on one of them. Thank you. If you had a business that couldn't tell you what it was going to cost to put out a set of products, couldn't tell you when they were going to get it done, but said eventually we'll get there, how likely is it that you'd buy that business or keep it?
That would not be in the category of strong indicators for that business.
Thank you.
And it would cause me to ask a lot more questions.
Well, let me go to the next question. That's just, we talk about the value of the assets. There's been a lot of discussion about that. Mr. Scoble, how do we pay for the, quote, assets? I do use that term loosely in the case of the FAA. How do we pay for those assets that we already have?
Mostly they're funded by excise taxes on ticket sales, gas taxes from GA users. There's a small infusion as well from the general fund. So.
And Mr. Brown, you have a lot of assets in your business. And what depreciation schedule do you use on them?
7 years on capital equipment.
That's about 7 years. You fully depreciated them. Usable life on a lot of the equipment is what, 10 years?
Yeah, it can be longer, but yeah.
Yeah, not much longer than, especially not in major capital. Mr. Scoville, what's the average age of some of the equipment that's in the FAA right now?
The air traffic
Air
control
traffic control,
infrastructure is aging and getting older by the minute, obviously. The en route centers that manage high altitude traffic, maybe 50 years on average, 25 years on average for terminal radar approach control.
I'd like
facilities.
someone to explain to me, maybe in writing some way, why we're losing our mind about, quote, the value of these assets when, in fact, in the real world, outside these hallowed halls, the value of the assets is less than zero. In fact, the question is how you dispose of them if, in fact, there were value in those, if you couldn't use those assets. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about assets that have gone beyond their half-life, yet we somehow think we're giving them away to somebody. In fact, in some of these assets, we want someone to take them away. Follow-up question also, if you can, Mr. Poole. The countries that have gone to some version of privatization, third party other than government running their ATC system, 60 countries or so, they all had safe, relatively safe airline or flight systems before they divested, right?
Yes, they did. And the study that was done by 3 universities about a decade ago looked at, I think it was 5-year before and after comparison of 10 of those countries and found that safety didn't go down in any of them, and it was either the same or better following the corporatization.
Mr. Rinaldi, some question. Did you, they all had safe systems as they made that transition?
Yes.
Any of your cohorts around the world say, oh my God, we've gone to a third party or a privatized system and the world is now threatened?
Completely opposite. Most of them would never go back to government structure.
See, I've flown Canada's system, I've flown Europe's system, and for better or for worse, flown the system here. I've got some interesting routing we could talk about, Mr. Brown. Flying back to Detroit through Fort Wayne was an interesting route. That was quite helpful. The point is that there's a lot of discussion about bifurcating the FAA. Just because it was together when they created this thing, somehow there's a discussion that it's a terrible thing to talk about making it more efficient and separated. Like somehow it's a holy ground. It's not working well. It's costing us a ton of money, yet the argument is we just throw more money at it. We hope it will get better. We had a saying in my company, hope is not a plan, it's the last step before desperation. We are at desperation. One more comment, which is about the discussion about being controlled by the outside stakeholders. Big parts of my district are powered by rural electric cooperatives, lots of stakeholders, lots of interests. And those people wouldn't give that up for the world because you know what? It actually worries first about the customers and service and not about the politics, about what you talked here about sequestration, all the other mess. It worries first about are we delivering the service we promised to deliver. That's my hope for ATC reform. And a board that has a fiduciary interest to deliver the service at a cost that we can actually manage. Thank you, sir. My time is up. You've been patient. You wrapped your gavel. I'm done.
I thank the gentleman. And next is Mr. Weber is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Scoville, when you had your comments, you said you'd identified some long-standing management weaknesses. Can you elaborate on those?
They were, yes. Thanks for the opportunity. By management weaknesses, I'm referring to those in FAA's acquisition practices. We cited in our testimony overambitious planning. ADS-B and ERAM would be key examples of that. I cited in our testimony the need for stable requirements for acquisitions to be successfully executed. ERAM and SWIM programs would be examples of where FAA had shortcomings in that area. Contract oversight generally across the board. As we have audited FAA's programs, we have found areas that needed significant improvement, all the way from incentive fees to the requirement, FAA's own requirement for independent government cost estimates in sole source contracting, which some FAA acquisitions personnel weren't even following their own requirements. So as you can see, there have been some significant shortcomings along the line. They've affected not only the NextGen programs proper, but others that are in support of other areas of air traffic control in NextGen.
My first year on the committee, I know you said that you had received the label the committee's biggest skeptic.
hired skeptic.
Hired
should say.
skeptic.
And sir, if I may, I wasn't skeptical of the committee. I was skeptical.
Glad you clarified that.
Of information, of proposals of information with the idea of bringing data for the committee's consideration.
Okay, great. How long have you been the hired skeptic?
A little over 10 years now, sir.
10 years. Okay, so you've been doing this and watching this FAA for 10 years. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
You said there were some requirements for them to continue to evolve. So fix those problems you just laid out for us. What are those requirements? If they were to stay in place, how does it evolve?
If FAA were to retain responsibility for air traffic control, first, continue to consult extensively with stakeholders. Where FAA has gone off the rails, largely it's because they haven't done that.
And you would think that the new process that the chairman is submitting would continue to consult with stakeholders?
Well, stakeholders would be in charge under a proposal, as I understand how it may ultimately be.
Well, they would have a board that's been discussed back and forth, but they would be constant, in that scenario, they'd be in constant communication with the stakeholders, their businesses, the different parts of the group. Go ahead.
True. I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood your predicate. I thought you were asking if FAA were to keep responsibility for air traffic.
Well, no, it was, but you're saying that
Sure.
they need to continue to, and I'm saying contrast that with what the recommendation here is, and that is that they would definitely be doing that. Go to step 2.
They do. Focus on the acquisition system, because I understand, my belief at least is that's the essence of the aviation community or users' dissatisfaction right now with FAA. It's not on the safety side. As we've all recognized, FAA right now is in what I called earlier the golden era of aviation safety, through its own efforts, industry's efforts, Congress's efforts, the efforts of my office. But where dissatisfaction is rising, it's in the air traffic control modernization era. So focus on FAA's acquisition practices, the acquisition management system, which is the regulation that governs FAA's practices, needs to be updated, it needs to be revised, the workforce needs to be properly certified and trained. All of those things that I talked about earlier about planning, requirements.
Could be done in the new system that the chairman is proposing. Let me stop you if I may, because I'm running out of time. Mr. Poole, standalone airports, I've got a couple small ones. Well, let me do this first. Mr. Rinaldi, you said that y'all represented 40 or something of those airports?
94.
94, thank you. Mr. Poole, back to you. What happens to those airports now?
Well, those airports are owned by municipalities usually. They
Right.
get funding from the AIP grant program. None of that would change. That AIP would continue to be an FAA function and do that. The main criterion affecting those small airports is whether they have a tower or not. And if they have a tower and it's obsolete and needs to be replaced, how is it going to get paid for, and can it be afforded? And that's where I think, first of all, the legislation can spell out that everybody is entitled to a tower that meets the benefit-cost ratio, and the funding capability, financing capability, and openness to better technology of the corporation would very likely adopt remote towers as a more cost-effective way to be able to expand the scope of tower services to small airports that may not qualify today, but probably could with a better benefit-cost ratio. So I think there's a very bright future for small airports.
Okay, thank you for elaborating, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Lamalfa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much discussion on the reform of FAA and air traffic controllers, and no doubt the controllers are doing very well with what they have to work with. But when we see the potential here for improvement with reform, like a previous GAO report showed that reforms like we're talking about would have really no negative impact on safety. In many cases, safety improved. And what we haven't seen is that throwing more money at it, FAA had not really improved anything, but even in some cases a negative effect. Potential for savings, as we've seen with the oft-spoken Canada system, shows that we can have a very positive effect on safety as well as saving money. And so what I wanted to ask Mr. Poole and Ms. Robin would be, can we really expect that these savings that would be achieved can be actually passed down to the consumers on what they would expect for their costs?
Well, that's a obviously good question to ask, and that depends really on, is there a competitive airline market? If there's a competitive airline market, then lower costs are more likely to be passed on in ticket prices, for example, than if there's not a competitive market. And I think there's some concerns being raised about how competitive our airline market has gotten to be in recent years. And there's some things we don't have time to discuss here, things Congress could do to try to make the airline market somewhat more competitive than it has been.
Okay. Ms. Robin? Similar? Okay. Ditto?
Yeah, and I think also, in addition to passing savings on, I think you were trying to expand the system, allow more throughput. You need new technology to do that. We're not at the cutting edge of that. You need new technology in order to allow for an expansion of the system.
For both of you, again, if we were to move in this direction of ATC privatization, smaller airports, rural airports, the threat of towers closing, what might be the expectations we would see for rural airports, just in general? I know we've been touching on it here, but what's it going to mean for rural airports and their viability?
Well, I'll repeat what I said a few minutes ago. I really think that a better funded and system able to do large-scale capital financing, one of its priorities would be facility replacement and some degree of consolidation, but also expanding the scope. Right now, as I said, we have a moratorium on contract towers. FAA has a moratorium that is denying a couple dozen airports that are on a waiting list. Some of them have already qualified in terms of benefit-cost ratio, but there's just no funding available for FAA to do that. A well-funded system that is focused on serving its customers better and open to aggressively using new technology like remote towers, I think offers the best future I can imagine for small airports in this country.
Well, thank you for that. I'm running out of time. I want to jump to Mr. Scoville for a second here on talking about contract towers. Okay, so they are pretty important at smaller service airports and general aviation, et cetera, in that airports that have there's up to 50% of civilian airports that have military operations use contract tower airports. Now, it's very important to have these operations, which is around 250 of them in the country. Would you comment, please, Mr. Scoville, on the value of the contract towers to air traffic safety and efficiency in our nation's system and the cost effectiveness of this to FAA and as well as taxpayers?
Yes.
Okay.
At this committee's request, we reviewed the FAA's federal contract tower program several times, and we've concluded that generally they are as safe, they are as well respected and appreciated by users as FAA-operated towers, and on average, they save or avoid for FAA $1.5 million per year in costs versus FAA-operated towers.
Per tower?
Per tower, correct.
Significant, okay.
We would cite federal contract towers as a missed opportunity for FAA. We understand that in recent years there have been funding difficulties perhaps, but well before that, FAA had opportunities to pull more towers into the federal contract tower and took a pass. It's been a decade or longer since FAA has moved any towers into the federal contract tower program.
Perhaps we should move more then.
Depends on funding.
Always that. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Perry is recognized for 5 minutes. Finally, Mr. Perry.
Finally. Well, I haven't been here half of the meetings. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your time. I had a lengthy question for Mr. Scoville about contract towers, but I think I missed half of them, and Mr. LaMalfa just asked one. But suffice it to say, the only thing I want to add, in case it hasn't been added, that it's important to note that 47% of all military operations at civilian airports are at contract tower airports. And I'm a a rotary wing guy, so not too much on the low altitude and route chart. The sectional is probably more important. But that having been said, it seems to me, based on at least the answer I got to hear from regarding my colleague's question, that you feel that they are efficient and cost-effective to the FAA and to the taxpayer. Is that a fair summation, Mr. Scoville?
Yes.
Okay.
Completely
all right,
fair. Thank you.
And I know that's not necessarily the context of this hearing, but I think the context is that, well, I just use this. Between 96 and 2012, the FAA's budget increased by 95%. Meanwhile, productivity decreased substantially, and we're talking about personnel procurement and organizational reforms, which, doing the same thing over and over again. While I appreciate Mr. Brown saying we can tweak this, my argument would be is that we have tried and tried to, it seems, not great effect, right? And I think I'm probably being kind, right? Not great effect. Let me ask you this, probably Mr. Poole maybe and Mr. Rinaldi. I'm really interested in the UAS propagation in the United States and a UTM, and I'm wondering in the context of what we're talking about, the proposal policy model that we're talking about, if either one of you could describe what you feel your organization, especially you, Mr. Rinaldi, would feel needs to be in place if that's currently missing for us to come to some kind of UTM, because we've put requirements on the FAA to come up with something here, and there are deadlines, but I feel like we're just way behind, and I just want to make sure that there's not something we're missing from your viewpoint.
Thank you, sir. Safely integrating UAVs into our airspace is a monumental task, and it's taken a lot of resources within the FAA, and certainly distracting us from working on NextGen as we're working on bringing UAVs into and incorporating them into our system. So one of the things I would like to see is some type of user fee base for these UAVs, so they actually can pay into the Aviation Trust Fund right now and pay for the system like everyone else does pay for the system.
Is there a model that you know of regarding some kind of a participation for maybe commercial users as opposed to incidental private? I'm just curious because I think it's an important concept, but
it's a great question, and I think everybody is kind of scratching their head right now because they're not using fuel, and we base most of on fuel or ticket tax, and they wouldn't have either or that. So we actually have to come up with a new concept. So
it might be like miles flown or something like that, right?
Well, I'm really not sure how it would work
be a user fee. Okay, well that's an important part of the discussion, and I'm glad you brought it up. Mr. Poole, what's your input? Do you know what the airlines want to see in integrating?
I have no idea what the airlines think about this. I do know there's a lot of interesting. I think there's a possible bifurcation between the very low altitude, mostly hobbyist uses of UASs, where there's a lot of interest in some kind of non-FAA sort of private solution to this that Silicon Valley folks are talking about in cooperation with NASA. So I think we need to separate that in terms of being different from the controlled airspace in which our airliners and many private planes fly.
But there are going to be incursions into controlled airspace, whether it's at the aerodrome
that's a significant problem we need to deal with.
There are incursions now in both controlled and non-controlled airspace, which is part of the issue, and I feel like that we need to get to it. But anybody else have something to add?
No, we do see a lot of incursions today and a lot of spottings that commercial airlines are seeing. And I think the sooner we can safely integrate them and come up with a process, the safer the system will be.
So while I would agree with you, it does divert some attention, resources, time, energy, what have you. You can't just ignore the fact, right?
I would not
I think
ignore
that's
it.
really, really foolish, right?
It's an emerging technology. It's an emerging user into the system. It's a very important user into the system.
And I think actually, to a great extent, it can be an enhancement. I mean, some of the technologies that are emerging, especially in the navigation arena itself, could be used commercially to greatly enhance. I was talking to the gentleman next to me. I know my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, but as an aviator myself, the sky is unlimited. I'm limited on the ground. When I pull out of the parking lot, I got to stay on the road, right? Or I'm going off-road. And yet we have the same system since I've been flying for 20 or 30 years now. I essentially got to take off and then go get on the highway instead of just literally from point to point, which I don't know what the savings is estimated at going literally from point to point, but it's got to be monumental over thousands and millions and billions of flights, right, commercially or otherwise. So anyhow, Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. And with that, Mr. Sanford is recognized for 5 minutes. Mike?
Mike, there we are. I thank the chairman. I just want to bore down just for 1 second. I guess I'd begin with you, Mr. Rinaldi. From an air traffic control standpoint, a blip is a blip, right?
Well, not necessarily. We work all airplanes safely and efficiently. There are some heavy aircraft that you need wake turbulence separation. So each blip, for lack of a better term, gets treated safely and efficiently, but there are different ways to work them.
Fair enough. But the wingtip vertices off of a Piper Cub is going to be very different than the wingtip vertices off a 747 in terms of separation, all those kind of, and that's what you're getting. But from the standpoint of management, it's essentially the same, right?
Yes.
So I think that one of the things that I've heard, particularly from the cargo carrier side, is a fear that if you move, are they going to be disproportionately impacted in that they weigh more from a traffic control standpoint? They don't take more time. They don't really use more stuff. But are they going to be disproportionately impacted relative to other smaller? And I just love, I see you shaking your head up and down. I don't know if it means yes or no, but I'd love to hear some of y'all's thoughts on that, because I think that that's one of the things that, as we go through these deliberations, we've really got to ferret out. Yes, ma'am. You were.
On the pricing side, most economists would say the current approach of pricing based on the ticket tax is very inefficient because it isn't correlated with the costs that users impose on the system. And so you want to go to a cost-based system. What the rest of the world uses is a weight and distance charge, and they use weight because they can't fully cover their costs typically with just a distance charge. That's marginal. You want to charge marginal cost, but you want to cover your full cost. And weight is a way of doing that. It's called Ramsey pricing in economic terms. And the cargo folks object to that. And I think there's some really important analysis to be done about just how big that weight component has to be. I think there is reason to think that the FAA may overstate their fixed costs, which is what requires you to have a weight component to the charge. There is a tendency for regulated utilities to overstate their fixed costs versus their marginal costs. So I think this is a really important issue, and I don't think we should just blindly adopt the standard weight and distance charge.
Yes, sir.
I've looked into this. In a 2001 Reason Foundation study, we actually had a lot of dialogue with one of the major cargo carriers, and they persuaded us that a strict weight distance formula would cause a significant increase in the cost share that they would pay. And we came up with an idea that said, all right, look at...
Wait, and let me interject.
Yeah.
It's ultimately not they pay, it's we pay, since
they're
going to pass it on.
Yes,
Yeah. But anyway.
So what we came up with was we looked at the flight patterns by time of day, and it turned out that most of the cargo flights do not take place at the busy times of day or at the busiest hubs at those times of day. And so if you put into the pricing formula a congestion factor, that you could basically hold the cargo carrier's share to about what it is today without having to discard the global standard of an overall weight distance formula. ICAO does permit congestion-related factors going into airport and air traffic pricing. Hardly anybody does it except the UK major airports, Heathrow and Gatwick, but that is consistent with ICAO charging principles, and I think that's a way that should be definitely explored for the cargo airlines.
I think that's fascinating in that if you look at this notion of optimizing the use of our infrastructure in this country, I think this notion of going to premium pricing based on congestion or load is going to become a bigger issue, whether it's on surface transportation, air transportation, or other. I see I have 25 seconds, but it looked like you had a thought down there at the end, but maybe you didn't.
I have many thoughts, sir, but not on this particular appointment. Thank you.
Fair enough. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Davis recognized for 5 minutes.
I bet I can guess that thought. When is this going to be over? And then you got members like me that keep coming in and out. I apologize that we're shuttling back and forth between two different committee hearings today, but this is a very important one. One that I believe from many of the responses that we've heard today and many of my colleagues that, it centers on what's really this debate of what's the cost of doing nothing. I mean, it's already cost the taxpayers billions of dollars to put towards NextGen, and we're not seeing the progress that we as America, with the air system that we have, be upgraded to be able to even compete on the same level with some of our allies. I can't help to compare it to work that's already been done, and we've discussed this today. You have what's been done in Canada, what's been done in the United Kingdom. Canada's bought twice the technology at half the cost and has done so in a third of the time. So let me start with you, Mr. Rinaldi. What do you think would be the cost of doing nothing?
Yes, status quo or doing nothing is unacceptable. September will be here before we know it. We will be looking at another possible government shutdown. And as I said in my opening statement, as we lead up to a shutdown, the FAA turns their attention from NextGen or from UAV implementation to shutdown procedures. And this is happening, for the last 10 years. It happens a couple of times a year, and we lose this time. And it's 4 or 5 weeks leading up to it, 5 weeks on the back end of it, and they're not sure what sequester is going to bring us if we actually do get a budget and do get a bill passed, or what type of cuts we're going to have into the aviation system. A lot of discussion about rural America. I will tell you, and you remember, sir, that when sequester hit in 2013, the FAA looked at closing over 238 air traffic control towers.
That was a very interesting list, contained a lot of them in my district.
Most of them in rural America, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. Mr. Poole, do you have any comments on this?
I think almost everything has been said, but I think, no, the technology, your comparison with NAV Canada is brilliant because they have things that we are only planning now. They have fully rolled out nationwide controller pilot data link, which we're looking at, maybe 6 or 8 years before we have that in en route airspace. They have across the North Atlantic very soon satellite-based positioning thanks to their investment in Aviation, this satellite-based global coverage. All the places that don't have radar, which is 70% of the Earth's surface, will now have radar-like separation possible because NAV Canada and several other ANSPs have invested in that and are now subscribing to it, and FAA was unable to invest and can't figure out how to subscribe to it. So, the idea that we are the gold standard, most modern in the world is no longer true, and the status quo, the more the status quo continues, the less that's going to be true. We're going to be falling farther and farther behind the state of the art.
Well, as we wind this hearing down, I want to make sure that we reiterate a few points. This new ATC entity is not going to decide where airlines or anyone can or cannot fly, correct? All right. Can you say it a little louder in the microphone?
That is correct. They will not decide anything about where airlines fly.
Thank you. And Ms. Robine, I want to address some more information that I've seen about the motives of the board under the AIR Act proposal. Despite the fact that the bill clearly states that 2 directors will be appointed by the Secretary of Transportation to act in the public interest, some have questioned the motives of the board. Can you describe your understanding of the governance of the board and how it will actually operate? Microphone.
Congressman Mitchell referred to the electric cooperative in his district, and it is analogous to the cooperatives that we have in the utility industry, the agriculture, insurance.
And they work, right?
Yes, they work beautifully. It is given that it is still, air traffic control provision is still a monopoly. I think technology will change that, but for the time being, it is still a monopoly. So you need a design that protects against any kind of monopoly abuse. And the Canadian model does that by having the stakeholders on select the board members, and having the board members are fiduciaries, as the chairman emphasized in his introduction. They have a fiduciary responsibility that has been critical to NAV Canada's success.
And quote of the day, entities like this that are already operational work beautifully. So I appreciate that. And we as policymakers,
Keep going.
thank you. We as policymakers don't have a lot of time here. You know, we can sit and debate what's working and what's not. And Mr. Rinaldi mentioned the FAA's got to deal with not only NextGen, but UAS technology, where I once questioned an official about what Canada's doing correctly. We don't have a lot of time to fix this. Today's the time to act. Now's the time to act, which is why this is so important. So thank you.
Thank the
And I yield
gentleman.
back.
We don't have much time, but we do have time for Mr. DeFazio to have 5 minutes and me to have 5 minutes because they've called a vote. And we've got 12 minutes and 28 seconds, so I will strictly enforce the 5-minute rule.
Okay,
for both.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to point out in the DOD memo, there is a sentence, and recognizes the potential risks regarding DOD's national security responsibilities. I'd like to put in the record an article from the National Observer in Canada. Headline, inspectors say major Canadian airline disaster likely, and they talk about the major cutbacks in the safety which was retained by the government. And then I would move on. Ms. Robine, do you remember Executive Order 13180 by President Clinton? No? Okay.
Is that the one that created the ATO?
The one that says air traffic control is an inherently governmental
Yes,
function.
the date of that is December 7th.
Thank you, Ms.
and
Robine. I don't
they
have
were
time.
still.
Ms. Robine, I don't have time. Thank you. So, Mr. Scoville, hold that up. Come on. Okay, so we just kind of said, oh, our assets are old, and someone down there said they're not worth anything. How old's that? I think that's 13, right? That is Houston, valued at $62 million. Then, of course, we have property in Long Island, kind of valuable. I mean, have you broken out the assets in terms of property values? In Canada, they valued the system and they had to pay for it, correct?
They did.
Okay. And the Inspector General in Canada, Auditor General, said they paid, this is Canada, little dinky Canada, they paid $1.5 billion, and we're proposing that nothing would be paid here and there's no value. And they said it was undervalued at 2.6. How old was their system? Because you're saying, our system's old and decrepit, and these guys say it's not worth anything. Was theirs brand new, spiffy back then?
No.
Okay. So they paid for it, but here we have a much larger investment that we're going to transfer for free, and of course we have the whole problematic thing about takings. Now, and you valued it at $13.7 billion. Let's say, how much of that would you depreciate?
How much of that would depreciate it?
No, I mean, yeah, it's what's land value versus
Right.
building, you don't know.
That's the infrastructure alone. I don't believe it involves the property value.
Okay, okay. So it's quite valuable. Now let's go to small airports. Almost everybody on that side is sensitive to GA. They represent more rural districts. And we heard that they will not direct where people fly. That's correct. But this board will decide where we invest. Here's the statement of the CEO of JetBlue. We also need to direct infrastructure improvements into the regions of the country where they'll produce the most benefits, like the Northeast Corridor. The airlines get 4 seats on that board. That's the opinion of JetBlue. We heard the same thing from the former CEO of United. And oh, by the way, there's no airport representative on the board whatsoever, at least as the bill was written last year. So we're going to say we're going to protect rural interests. We're going to pretend it. Now, Mr. Brown, you talked about WAS. There are 4,421 WAS. Did those come for free? And do they have to be maintained, updated?
Well, the FAA, like night elves, produced them one airport at a time until they arrived on my doorstep, and I was amazed by them, but they got paid for by the user fees and fuel taxes that fuel the system.
Yeah, we've heard how much money has been wasted, except we've been investing in things like that which aren't valuable to the commercial industry. Except for maybe Jackson Hole and a couple other places, does the commercial industry use those?
Anybody can use those if they have the right equipment. The problem is most of the airlines don't have the right equipment.
Well, that's interesting. So anybody know of another country in the world that is ready to turn on a ground-based ADS-B system in 2020 for all their air traffic anybody who's so equipped. Any other country in the world doing that? Ground-based domestically, not over the ocean.
Australia, it's already
Okay.
in operation.
Okay, so we got one, and we're going to be there too. So, you know, we've heard a lot about this over-the-ocean stuff. You know, I'm not particularly concerned about the tiny fraction of over-the-ocean flights we control and whether or not they get free ADS-B, because there aren't that many planes to worry about the congestion and flying closer together. Whereas domestically, you know, we may get some benefit from the system, but it still begs the question of how many planes can you land at the same time at many of our airports, which has to do with airport scheduling. Revenues. Apparently, there's an assumption that that Congress will repeal the ticket tax. And I mean, right now, our current taxes are yielding about $14 billion a year. And, you know, the ATO is 11.1. So that assumes Congress is going to repeal substantial taxes, I assume. That's correct. And then the new board will determine how to pay for the ATO. Okay, I see a nodding of the head, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and let me start off first by saying that investment will not be directed by this new board. There will still be IP funds that will be going directly out to these small and medium-sized airports around the country, so that's not actually accurate. You know, one of the things that Ms. Titus brought up, which I think is very, very important, and she was directed to Mr. Rinaldi, was about the air traffic controllers. And let me tell you, one of my biggest concerns in this proposal is that we make sure we move those highly trained, highly technical, highly skilled, efficient air traffic controllers to the new system. And if you don't do it in the right way, a third of them, I think I'm correct, a third of the certified controllers can retire tomorrow if they're not happy. So for me, that's something very important. And I can tell you what, I've been criticized by conservative groups around this town because they just don't get it. You have to take the qualified workforce with you. So, Mr. Rinaldi, I know we talked a little bit about the count going up at NAV Canada. The controller count goes up. What are your thoughts on not only the controller count, but middle management?
Well, if you look at, it was brought up earlier, with NAV Canada, when they were in government, they had roughly 6,800 employees, of which 2,000 were air traffic controllers. Now that they're a high-functioning, not-for-profit corporation, they have about 4,300 employees, of which 2,000 of them are roughly air traffic controllers. So the controller workforce stayed the same or went up a little bit. It is the middle management that they attrited through retirement in a humane way, and they just didn't backfill those positions. I call a lot of that, and you know, between the middle management within the agency and the multi-layers of contractors they have within the agency also. That's one of the things. It's already being privatized out there with all these contractors within FAA headquarters. I call that the clay. It actually stops good things from happening at the very top, and it's and things that are happening trying to change at the operational level.
And so for those of us that aren't geologists, nothing permeates down and nothing permeates up.
Yeah,
correct. I understand what clay is then.
15 levels of no to get to yes.
Exactly. And then finally, I just want to make the point here that, first of all, there was someone was said along here that the restriction, the airspace would be restricted. We made it clear in Air 1, but maybe not clear enough to make sure that this new entity will not be able to restrict airspace. Plain and simple. And we're going to strengthen that language to make sure the general aviation community knows they are not going to be restricted by this new entity. That's the FAA's having the regulatory oversight of this, if that's the case, to do something like that. Second, when we talked about NAV Canada, and our system is 10 times larger. No doubt about it. I believe because we are so big and so complex, that's a reason to move to this system so that we can manage it much better. We're already to the scale, the size to handle those greater operations. 3,000 facilities, 14,000 controllers, 6,000 technicians, 5,000 managers. We are scaled to handle this today. And then I might add, again, and this is something that's very troubling to me. It should be troubling to anybody that's in the business world. We are 9 to 10 times larger, depending on how you want to measure it, to Canada. We spend 25 times to 28 times more in CapEx than they do. And as was mentioned by Mr. Davis, the former CEO of NAV Canada said, he gets twice as much technology at half the cost, 3 times as fast. So again, as a business owner, a former business owner, if we're spending 25 to 28 times more in CapEx and we're getting very little for it, that's a real problem. That's a real problem for the American taxpayer. That's a real problem for the system. If we were doing it efficiently, my goodness, how if we could drive the cost down. And as I spoke to the folks at NAV Canada, and I think everybody understands, this is a volume business. And if we go to the system, our volume is so tremendous, it'll dramatically drive down the cost. And we'll have more money out there to do things to help more communities, to do things to help the efficiency, the technology, the employees. So again, this is something we got an opportunity. And I said to the airlines when I was here last time, this is when they did something very wrong. We have an opportunity here to do something very right. And I hope we seize this opportunity because I'm afraid it's not going to come along again. Ms. Robine, I think I'm the first one that called you the right name today, Robine. I know you've been engaged in this for a number of years. You started in the Clinton administration, and I appreciate all the value you bring here, as well as Mr. Poole. Mr. Brown, thank you so much for being here today. Your perspective is very valuable to us. Again, I want to reiterate, I'm a GA guy. I'm a rural guy. There is nothing I want to do to hurt those people that are my constituents. But I think what we have at hand here is something to help the United States of America to continue for us to be the leader in aviation around the world. So again, thank you all for being here today. Appreciate your time. And I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such times our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments, information submitted by members, witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank the witnesses again. And there are no other members, so we're adjourned. Thank you.